Hey guys, it's Rumour. I'm here with Harpy and Djinn, and we're going to do a shelf awareness reading for you of Ruinfall. So I'm going to be taking Plague's place, and Harpy and Djinn are each going to be reading their own characters. So go ahead and introduce yourselves, guys.
Hey, I'm Harpy, and I'm also Edalene.
And I'm Djinn and also Aeodan.
Perfect. So we're going to go ahead and get started. This thread is 6 pages, so we will not be reading the whole thing right now. This will basically be a part one of possibly three. We'll see how long we can go today. Um, and we'll link to the thread in the video comments so you can see it. All right, here we go, guys. History does not repeat itself. It rhymes. Raelith. 7th of Ashen, 717. Shit! The shout echoed along the corridors of bookshelves and out into the foyer of the university library. Scholars paused in their research to gaze back toward the circulation desk and the offices beyond. Solemnity was rarely breached in a place as hallowed as this, stack upon stack of ancient scribbling waiting for another bright mind to draw them together. This was a place of discovery, not some open forum. Shit. The voice came again, quieter, almost apologetic. Shit, 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 shit. Professor, please, we're in a library, came a softer reply. A blonde woman emerged from behind the circulation desk, hair pulled into a severe bun while her abdomen swelled almost painfully with child. Behind her, abashed, a middle-aged man with gray in his temples and copper wire glasses followed. He was a portly man, belted and swaddled with the clothes of his trade. Archaeological tools hung from sewn straps in his coat and festooned his belt. 3 long lacquered scroll cases bounced against his back. Adjusting the small frames, he took them off and wiped them hastily, following the waddling woman to one of the side offices. Melina, you're jesting. You jest. You joke, and although I've noted some improvement in your wit, this was a poor attempt indeed. Melina leveled a long, withering look at the smaller man and sighed, closing her eyes as the ire melted away from the corners. Thomas, I'm not joking. I'm clearly not joking. The midwife said only a matter of days now, and the rigors of your ruin hunts would be dangerous for the child. She laid her hands across the swell of her stomach protectively, but her eyes were not cruel. Ask the board for another. Surely you can get along without me. Without you? Thomas reeled as if struck, shoving the glasses against his face so hard it appeared he almost snapped the bridge. He winced. My Melina, my TA, my orderly, intuitive, perceptive Melina, my sun, my light, my... Melina cleared her throat, and Thomas scowled. I'm lost without your organization. You know that. I simply cannot do it without you. Can't we just... He leaned in close and mimed a knock above the swell of her abdomen. Tell the bloke to wait several more trials. Surely 9 would be plenty to conduct our research, and... The danger, Thomas. You forget. Besides, I can't go scaling ruins in this state. She indicated her stomach. It's like carrying a pack from the front, but I can't simply remove it. Ask the board for another. My answer is a firm no. Thomas collapsed into one of the desk chairs, pressing his hand over his entire face and groaning into it. My ink will end up in my canteen again. I just know it will. Curse it all. Curse the bah. He stopped, looking at her sheepishly. I didn't mean it, of course. I take it back, my dear. My flower, my brilliant pupil. I'm just sunk, you know? Sunk without someone of your skill. Besides, a new student? Some stranger skulking about my research? I can't have that. You know the appetite of the academic rivals the great Cassian. The appetite of the academic rivals the great Cassian himself. Why, I'd wager 9 of 10 discoveries in the last 10 years alone were stolen from their rightful authors. Plagiary, Melina. We are besieged by cutthroat sycophants. He thrust suddenly out and to the side as if holding a cutlass. Scalvorus would be proud of our high seas banditry, and, my dear, I am not cut out for daring do of a corsair. Certainly not in these unfriendly waters. Reaching up a hand, she took it and ran her fingers along the back of his hand. Thomas seemed to calm and slumped, ruinous. Melina, tell me what to do. A dig site or a classroom, give me that stage and I'll be your grand commander, but in the intervening places, I won't survive. Melina continued to rub his hand, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling. When she found no answers, she closed her eyes and massaged a temple. Thomas, a moment from your tragedy, please. You want me to help, and I'll help, but I cannot endure your melodrama today. He glanced up at her, burying a frown in an embarrassed flush. He held up his other hand and rotated his wrist, urging her to continue. She ground her teeth only a moment before finding her compassion. There is a woman who works here, always punctual, exacting, organized. She's a bit of a sardonic and takes little patience with, she searched for the word and shrugged, well, melodrama like this, but she'll keep your books and journals exactly as you need them. I can go and have my child in peace, and you, she dropped his hand and slapped it lightly, can stop this belly aching and get back to your job. Every little setback is a cataclysm for you, isn't it, Thomas? I resent, he started to reply, though thought better of it and waved it off. You're right, my dear, of course. I lost my head again. You know how I am. Her frown was not an indictment, but she nodded the smallest of forgiveness. Thomas was all smiles again, bounding to his feet so fast Melina almost stumbled backwards. Quicker than a man of his girth should, Thomas caught the small of her back and guided her to balance, chuckling. Yes, well, must be careful, yes, must be whole and healthy to bring another scholar into our lovely world. He hopped away from her, giving Melina the time to regain her composure and waddle to the door. She leaned, slightly, pointing out at the long-haired, thin woman who had taken her spot behind the desk. Her name is Edalene, she said, frowning. And if you don't conduct yourself like a proper professor, she let him fill in the threat, but Thomas was already nodding. Of course, Melina. I shall be the picture of the prim and proper university staff. See how I strut and preen. I can look the part of any headmaster. You just watch. Melina opted not to answer that, as any moderation to his usual eccentric behavior was preferable, regardless of how melodramatic he interpreted it. Thomas strutted from the room and across to the circulation desk. Other scholars watched him warily, preparing to stand and leave should the short man fly into hysterics. He did not mask his approach, heavy footfalls as he navigated around stacks of yet unsorted return books. Edalene, yes? He asked, sidestepping into her periphery and effecting a short, bobbing bow. My name is Professor Thomas Theodore Terrence, from the Archaeology Department. He brought both his hands together a moment and then extended one. My assistant, Melina, well, she's in a family sort of way, you see, and I need a scribe and aide for a short expedition. He paused, waving his hands. 2 or 3 days at most, I assure, to examine claims of some ancient ruins outside Andaris. Melina suggested I speak to you about possibly taking her place, and I assure you I can speak to administration about perhaps, he considered it, a quarter of a credit hour for your participation.
Edalene shook the hair out of her face, frustrated, and reached for the ribbon around her wrist, only to find it was not there. Drat. Scowling, she pushed her long, frazzled hair behind her ears and looked down at the book on the desk, only for it to fall forward again. She sighed. Looking through the strands of her hair, Edalene strained to see the name of the book on the desk. The Rise of the Eternal Empire. History. Edalene took the book and added it to one of the many teetering piles of books, before turning to the uncategorized ones, the ones that need to be returned to the stacks. She was exhausted. The night before, it had been late and she'd had barely any sleep. But still there was a peace in her, a peace that she had not felt for many arcs. They had given Godrin a resting place, and she'd spent an entire evening with her love, even if he did not love her back. And they were leaving this wretched town, this place of ghosts and horror, and who knew what they would find in Vidon. Her heart stuttered at the thought. Vidon, a land of knowledge, of libraries, of silence and thought. Aeodan looked so excited when he spoke of it, and how could she not give him what he needed, what he wanted? If only Narav decided to come with. But no. She squashed that thought. No, he would come. She did not need to worry. It would all work out. And so she worked. The department were none too happy to be losing one of their most dedicated researchers. They had let her go. Transferring from the university to the academy was easy enough, but it was almost as if they were giving her the most boring jobs out of spite or resentment for leading her. But still, she worked at them silently, grateful in a way for the easy work, tiring as packing and preparing to leave was. So she catalogued and would not let herself dwell on the Rav. No, it would all work out. And then someone interrupted her work. She looked up with a scowl, but it transformed into a look of bewilderment when she saw the bowing, bobbing little man with a ridiculous name. He spoke at 100 miles an hour, but it took a moment for Edalene to catch up. A moment of silence followed while her brain worked. Yes, I'm Edalene, she trailed off. An expedition? With the archaeology department? It was more up Aeodan's field, but he struggled with physical activity. Besides, it was a credit. She swallowed, made a quick decision. They weren't leaving for a few trials. She could do this one last thing. Better than categorizing books, anyway. Yes, sir, I'm available. What do I need to do and where do I meet you? She paused and made a split-second decision. Sir, is it all right if my brother accompanies us? He works with the anthropology department, and I know he'll be an asset on this trip.
Professor Terrence frowned, even before he could temper it to look polite. It was a brief cloud of annoyance that darkened the sun of his beaming enthusiasm, gone the moment it appeared. Yes, well, no. The storm of his discontent was met with the icy fury of Edalene's own stare, and that tension held for only a moment before Thomas relented, swinging his hands palm out between them as if banishing some frightful image. I mean, yes, of course, should be fine. Siblings, after all, I'm sure it can be... He trailed off, reaching for something, lost it, and gave up. You have a cruel gaze, my dear Edalene, a cruel, cruel gaze. Snapping his fingers, he hopped away from her and gathered up 2 books from the return pile. You'll need it. By the immortals, you'll need some steel in you for what we're about to endeavor. Thomas had almost crossed back toward the office when he paused, comically pirouetting on his forward foot to face her again. Speaking of, yes, the expedition. You wanted a taste, A little nibble before the feast? Of course, I can sympathize. His fingers scurried across the scroll canisters on his belt, pausing at each one only briefly before dancing to another. In the end, he settled for one sticking faintly from an interior jacket pocket. Snatching it up, he presented it to her inspection, before snatching it back and uncorking the copper top, fishing out a yellowed parchment between 2 fingers. Gently, he laid it out on the desk and waved her over to look. Gone were the random tremors and tics that made the man who he was. He was reverent now, holding out a rough map of the forest around Andaris. There was a place with a blot, a strange mark that bled through the page. Apart from that, it seemed no different from any other primitive piece of scrawling. You can't see it, my dear, but this is where we're going. There is wonder to be found here, something worth discovering. You'll have to take my word for it, but I imagine they will write books with our names as chapter titles when all is said and done. How exciting! He rolled the map up deftly and deposited it back in the case, slipping it in his pockets. Bright and early, my dear Edalene, you and your brother, should he choose to come. Pack for trouble, but do not pack too heartily. I will have more than enough to share for our short venture into the unknown. With an exaggerated bow, Thomas bounded out from behind the desk and towards the office, vanishing down a hallway. With his absence, the scholars collectively breathed relief, returning to their work and leaving Edalene to process the information. "South Gate!" Thomas hollered from down the hallway, drawing frustrated glares. "A mile out, bend in the road, can't miss it." His echoes faded, but his presence, that took so much longer to truly dissipate. The next trial. Morning had been thwarted as the sun sought solace in a sanctuary of heavy clouds. Gloom shadowed the road outside the Andaris gates, and the promise of rain whispered on the unseasonably chilly breeze. Thomas Theodore Terrence was exactly where he said he'd be, his shape engulfed by the leather canvas bag strapped to his frame and towering over his head. It was a small wonder that the small man had such muscle hidden beneath his paunchy exterior. He stood at the threshold of bark and loam, and on approach, a curious sound snuck around the professor to find their ears. It was a piping sound, lilting and sweet. It was almost the song of birds, but far more orderly. Thomas held a small pipe poised between his lips, his fingers dancing along the delicately carved holes down its slender shape. His eyes were closed, and he didn't seem to detect anyone coming up behind him. The music was cheery, but it didn't take long for them to realize that it was only part of a song he was playing. Perhaps it was the coda, but just before he might switch to the main melody, he took the briefest of pauses and began the coda again. Again. Again, as if he were searching for the rest of the song in the worship of repetition.
Edalene held the professor's gaze easily. He was a bumbling man, obviously not a fool, but still, Edalene would not bend on this. She needed her brother, and she needed him to have the same opportunities she did. It was unfair that Aeodan was looked over so often purely because of his health, and Edalene had decided many arcs ago that she would be his champion. She stared at Terence. When he wavered and allowed Aeodan to come, a brilliant smile broke across her face. "Oh, thank you, sir. You won't regret it. He's brilliant, I swear." Success. Excitement rose in her as he scrabbled at his bed, pulling out an old and rusty canister with an even older map inside. Reverently, he unfolded the map, spreading it out on the desk. Edalene quickly moved the books out of the way, bending in to peer at the map. It was old, she could tell. As Terence spoke, she observed the map. Strange markings, and an even stranger mark in the middle of the map, as if blood was pooling through the parchment. The back of her neck itched. She wanted to ask more, but he rolled up the map and began to speed out the library, shouting out things he seemed to have forgotten as he went. A rueful smile twisted on Edalene's lips. This was an odd man, but she began to pack up her things and head for home. Excitement ran through her. Yes, they would write books about her and Aeodan, of course. The next trial. Edalene trudged wearily with her pack along the road in the grey and cold morning. She was alone and upset about it. Aeodan was too tired, too sore from the packing and upheaval from the last couple of trials. She could tell that he was upset about it too, but Edalene had truly wanted her brother with her for this adventure. He deserved it. Aeodan truly did. She approached, hiking her pack up, and then she heard it. The mournful tune from the professor's pipe circled endlessly through the wind as Edalene drew closer. He barely seemed to notice her approach, and as she drew nearer, she could tell he only played the same few notes. "Sir," she said as she drew near, not wanting to surprise him. "I'm sorry, my brother, his health, well, he's not up to the expedition. It's just me." She paused, wondering what to do now. "Your playing is beautiful." She looked to the edge of the forest, copse close by, and she itched with excitement. "Will we be leaving soon?"
Aedan bit his lip as he heard Edalene leave the house, saddened by her departure. He was exhausted from the previous trials, but something tugged at his heart at the sound of the closing door. There was a finality in the crash, and one that caused his heart to skip a beat. After a moment of indecision, he swung the covers from his nearly naked body, hauling himself to his feet. As soon as he did, a wave of pain exploded through his legs, weaving its way up like cobwebs in an attic. He grabbed the post of his bed to steady himself, and then steeled himself to the ache. He knew that there was likely going to be much aching ahead, so he would have to just man up and muscle through. Hastily, he hobbled about the room, collecting his clothes and stuffing them in a bag. Throwing on shorts and a light shirt, he set out from the house only 11 bits after his sister. Granted, he would not cover the ground as quickly as she, but if he was lucky, he'd catch the group before they moved on. As he walked, Aedan's mind wandered to the task set before them. This was exciting stuff, and Aedan was glad he made himself get out of bed. How many times had he allowed Edalene to go on without him because he was sad or sore? No, not this time. This time he would go with her and show her exactly how strong he could be. With a smile, he trudged on, poorly ignoring the exhaustion and pain in his legs. This was not the time to fail. As he approached the group, he could vaguely make out his twin's form, and the sight of her bolstered him. He increased his pace, breathing steadily through the pace. When he was close enough, he broke out in a wide smile and called to her, far enough behind her that his voice would sound slight in the wind. "Edalene!" His voice sounded further away than it was, and he wasn't made better by the heaving in his chest. He knew the pace would be grueling, but he was going to share this with his sister. In fact, he wanted nothing more than for the two of them to make some earth-shattering discovery and become the source of the texts they read for their jobs. With the thought in mind, he rapidly approached her and wrapped his wiry arms around her. "I'm sorry I couldn't catch up with you." His eyes shone in their excitement, and the silvery mark over his eye seemed to shimmer in the sun's light. He gave her a quick peck on the cheek and held her at arm's length. "So, let's get going, shall we?" From the corner of his eye, Aedan saw Thomas. Quickly, he turned to observe the eccentric man, a wide smile on his face. This should be interesting, he thought.
Thomas could see the gangly shadow of the young man making his way down the road behind her. Sickness, infirmity, well, they were words held like battle standards whenever a professor was asked to add a new class to their schedule. They were forgotten in the field. Oh yes, young Aeodan would cough blood at every step and still heft the pack against his narrow back. They both would. Scholars. The warriors could scoff all they like from behind a curtain of blood and swagger, but a scholar would march with both feet in the grave just to see the wonders over the rise. Slowly he dipped the small instrument from his lips and replaced it in his front pocket. It already hung, fastened, to a chain around his neck. "So lovely of you to say," he murmured quietly as Aeodan approached. "It's A War of Two Bridges, Uthaldrian, 3rd century. He did not continue or explain where the rest of the song had gone to. Instead, he shifted and hefted his own towering pack in a rattle of metal and fabric. Above them, the sky had darkened with clouds, settling in from the north. Thomas eyed them and grinned, drawing a hood up over his mess of hair. Plucking an old brass pocket watch from one of his many pockets, he checked the time and clicked tongue against teeth. "Welcome, welcome," he said to them both, stepping back far enough to rest an arm against one tilted oak spilling over the road. "You have the fortune of being part of a most auspicious expedition, a most curious venture." Up came his index finger, as if something in the sky were nodding off at its desk. "Today we will not be studying Ruinfall history or even a Ruinfall site. No, no, my bright-eyed scholars. We will be plunging head-first into a time before the word Ruinfall ever crossed the lips of the men who settled here." He paused in his lecture, waving an impatient hand at Aeodan. "Young man, I read your treatise on historical Ruinfall dialects. Lovely work, lovely. The comparison you drew to the common spoken in southern Nahar was a clever bit of linguistics. I felt, perhaps, your section on Chrome could have used a few more sources, and I lament you did not have the time to visit some of its farthest villages. Remarkable people there, truly. Did you know that 300 years ago, it would be 322 by my count, but really a speculation, of course." Both hands went out, came back to his side, and he leaned in conspiratorially. "A man claimed he was visited by a great bear that had come south from the woods, fashioned a sort of folk religion out of it. Beghesh, I think. Quite fascinating indeed." Waving it away, Thomas switched his hands. "All dead now, of course, put to the pyre by Lord Crome of the time, heresy and apostates and all. You know the rigmarole. But yes, fascinating people out there." He turned back towards Edalene and shrugged, straightening and embarrassed. "Apologies, my dear, but you're not really in my department. I haven't the time to read anything you've done, but I'm sure you're marvelous. Yes, marvelous. I saw it straight away." Yanking out the pocket watch again, he checked it and grinned. "As to when, my flower, my young scribbler," he nodded to each in turn, "we are to be off now. Step lively and step carefully. Plenty to go wrong on this leg of the journey, and oh, how you would lament the discovery you'd missed. Start on time, end on time. We've a long day of hiking ahead." Turning with a spin, surprisingly light on his feet for a man so burdened, Professor Terrence started off through the trees. Within 10 strides, his voice bellowed back to them, deep and resonant, scattering the birds like dandelion seeds and masking even the crash of their progress through the woods. He sang, but not in a language Edalene was familiar with. It took a few moments for Aeodan to settle on familiar words. It was an anthem from the Eternal Empire, very old dialect of Sulnesian, a rare language on its own. Thomas roared it as if the language were his and his alone, the chanting rhythm easily applicable to their own marching gait. He was unstoppable, implacable, it seemed, that no break could be short enough, although he took several to accommodate the less physically inclined students. Thomas was a study in extremes. One moment he leaped with such joy it might simply carry him above the trees themselves, and some hours he was a silent guide, pointing out various obstacles and dangers neither student would have been perceptive enough to see. Given his figure, Thomas should have tired long before he did, but the portly man seemed indomitable. Even as the rain fell in scattered sheets through the tall trees above them, Thomas did not tire. Mud seemed incapable of holding him in its bind, and his voice eclipsed even the thunder in some rare moments. He was every bit the force of nature that unfolded around him. To Edalene and Aeodan, the trek was a difficult one. The terrain was not particularly challenging, but the pace of the small professor began to wear against their endurance. Edalene gritted her teeth against the wet and the damp, but less for herself and more for Aeodan. She could almost feel the struggle her brother went through just to keep up with them both. Padding next to Edalene, silent and invisible to her brother, her bear granted her some measure of resilience against the exhaustion settling in her bones, but this was nothing she could confer to her brother. When they finally paused in the dreary wake of the storm, the whole forest dripping around them, Thomas examined the lengthening shadows and pulled out his watch again. Tapping against the lid, he bit his lower lip, looking off at some unseen destination through the curtain of branches before finally shrugging. "Oh, I suppose this is far enough for the day," he said, clearly without agreeing to his own statement. "Shall we pitch our expedition camp beneath these lovely sycamores?" Patting one, running his hand along the bark, he chuckled. "Oh my, quite the age our dear protector has. Worry not, my pale guardian, we shall not be cutting you down." Thomas lifted a finger, still talking to the tree. I may, however, impose on you to borrow some of your scattered branches. Surely you were finished with them anyways. Turning back to Aeodan and Edalene, he clapped both hands together. Yes, right. Now for the parts the explorers never write about. All fire, blood, and discovery, yes? Never anything of the work. One of you shall fetch wood and strike a fire, and the other shall begin to pitch your shelter for the evening. I shall pitch my own, and see if I cannot find us something tastier than rations, yes? He winked, slinging his huge pack off his back, and leaned it against the sycamore. Do not wander too far, and remember to breathe deep. Breathe deep and long. This is the scent of adventure. This is the smell of discovery and new grounds. Can you feel it, perhaps? He bent down and ran a hand along the dirt, his voice dropping to a whisper. Ancient men have walked before us. With a wink, he turned to the forest, vanishing between the trees with barely a sound to mark his departure.
Mere moments after she caught up with the professor, she heard a very familiar voice call her name. Whirling around with a grin on her face, she laughed. Aeodan, she cried, rushing over to him and slinging an arm around his shoulders. She knew he had been in a decent amount of pain these last few trials, and while worry for his health tugged at her chest, she couldn't help but be glad he had turned up anyway. What are you doing here? I thought you weren't coming. How are your legs, your health? The last two questions she asked in an undertone, not wanting the professor to overhear, but she couldn't help herself. Edalene would always worry about Aeodan. Edalene eyed the coming cloud skeptically, unused as she was to field work. She was aware that she'd only been asked on this expedition as a last resort, but in all honesty, study was study, and wherever it took her, Edalene would go in the pursuit of knowledge. As Thomas praised Aeodan, Edalene stayed silent, feeling uncomfortable. Even though the two of them had come by chance, it seemed that Aeodan would be the one more suited to the quest than she, but she could never feel resentment towards her twin. He was intelligent and deserved the praise he received. A wry smile twisted on her lips as Thomas pulled out his pocket watch. As a Shervain, she had no need of clocks, the one on her back of the neck keeping her wholly aligned with the time without effort. It's quite all right, sir, she murmured. Of course he hadn't read anything she'd written. And with this expedition irrelevant to her field of research, why should he? But the mention of the past, going back before even Rumour, Edalene couldn't help but feel a twitch of excitement. This is what Rylith and Tiartha had seen in her. With her move to Vidon upcoming, Edalene couldn't help but feel certain her heart was leading her to study a field beyond Rumour and far into the past. A smirk to Aeodan as they set off that she knew he would understand. The professor was so eccentric it made her want to giggle. She was sure at some point Aeodan and her would do just that. She might even make her brother laugh with a poor imitation of the man's idiosyncrasies. And with a glance to Aeodan, they set off through the woods. Edalene found the hike easier than she would have normally. Her great forest bear shimmered visible only to her, and she drew strength from him, imbuing the usually weak student with fortitude and endurance she might not have normally had. Still, she was grateful to the professor for the breaks he took, not for herself, but she knew Aeodan was struggling. One look at his scrunched face, and Edalene knew that his legs were giving him trouble, the rain certainly not helping. And so she walked closely to him, reaching out a hand to him whenever he wavered. Always there for him when he needed it. When they stopped, wet and soaked, not even her beloved bear could keep her strong. She was weary and knew Aeodan would be in agony, but still the professor bounded with seemingly endless supplies of energy. Edalene watched open mouth as he disappeared. There was a moment of silence, and she turned to her brother. Are you all right? She said, bending to him and wiping his fringe from his face, where it clung to his forehead, dripping with rain. What hurts? And she rubbed her hands along his legs, wishing she could take the pain from them and fling it into the sky. Stay here, she said, straightening. I will go to get firewood and try to start a fire, but with all this damp, I have no idea how I'll manage to do that. She shook her head in exasperation. If it hurts too much, stay seated. I'll build the shelter when I come back. Edalene bent and pressed a tender kiss to his forehead, and with a smile turned and went into the woods. She did not go far, only skirting around the clearing. She managed to find several pieces of firewood, not too damp, but had been sheltered a little from the storm. She collected leaves and sticks, as dry as she could find. She did remember to bring a flint with her. So long as they were dry enough, she should be able to start the fire.
After a few bits, Edalene returned to the camp and bent down, smiling at her brother. "Come on," she muttered to herself after arranging the wood into circles. The rain had mostly slowed, but it still took her several bits of striking the flint with a machete. Several times the kindling caught sparks, but it felt like ages until she was able to fan that into a flame. A grin on her face, and she knelt before the fire, grinning as it grew in size. "Aeodan," she called, "I did it. Come here and get warm. It'll help your pain."
Aedan smiled as he approached Edalene, the happiness radiating from his cheeks in ruddy splotches. He huffed as he drew close to her, but even his aching illness couldn't prevent him from sharing in his sister's jubilation. "I very well couldn't miss this, could I?" He smiled and hugged her tightly, before turning back to the professor in order to receive the instruction. The professor was a strange man, Aedan could tell from the very beginning. He was eccentric, but in a way that many would find uncomfortable and perhaps annoying. Aedan, also pedantic and eccentric, did not find him so. Instead, he confused Aedan with his dazzling brilliance and flamboyancy, and he was off before the brunette boy could really comprehend the praise flung at him so haphazardly. Oh, okay." Aedan watched the professor set off, hurrying faster than the aching boy could ever hope to. He looked at Ida with a slight smile, knowing that the trek ahead was going to be vigorous. When they set off, Aedan wrapped a thin hand through Edalene's, using her pace to help set his own. The trek was breakneck, especially for the boy brunette, but Aedan held his own despite the pace. In fact, the fire in his legs offered him incentive to keep up. Obviously, the professor was unconcerned with Aedan's condition, and the change was nice. Aedan rather enjoyed that Thomas did not care for his pains, and that he expected Aedan to carry his own weight as much as he would any other participant on the expedition. Aedan was determined to rise to the professor's challenge, and would prove to his sister and Thomas that he was more than prepared to undertake the rigors of field work. Each respite only hardened Aedan's resolve. The time they took increased the pain in his legs, and each time he resumed the pace, the searing spikes in his legs returned. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Aedan kept up with Edalene. He would be lying if he said he wanted to make camp, but he'd never say it out loud. And he did his best to keep the physical signs of his pain a secret. The last thing he needed was Edalene worrying about his legs. She always did, and he felt like it was holding her down. And finally, the professor brought them to a grove of sycamores. Edalene and Aedan set their packs down, and the professor instructed them to divvy up their responsibilities to more efficiently make camp. Edalene, though, concerned herself with ensuring Aedan's comfort, prompting the younger twin to sheepishly push her hands away. "I'm fine, Ida. Ida, seriously, I'm fine. Get off me, Ida." She was used to his fighting her, and she continued to try and help him anyway. Smiling despite himself, Aedan pushed her hands away. He was thankful when she rose to gather the wood, and Aedan nodded. "I can put the damn tents up, Ida. Don't worry so much about me. I'm not a little boy anymore." And with that, he pushed himself to his feet. The tent the twins brought covered the space for the two of them, so he luckily only had to put up one shelter. Still, Aedan had never erected the shelter before. When he was younger and his parents would take the twins into the forest, Ida always did the physical activities. Still, Aedan was determined, and an academic mind like his should not be foiled by a simple tent. Planting the first tent pole, Aedan went about unfolding the heavy canvas. His legs ached, and he stood trying to visualize how the tent should look when completed. Being able to see the finished product would allow the brunette boy to complete the project, or so he hoped. As long as it took Edalene to gather the wood, Aedan struggled with the tent. She came back into view, and it spurred Aedan to perform at a higher level. He planted the last pole and erected the heavy canvas tent, finally able to lie underneath it. As Ida sparked the fire, Aedan relaxed under the tent. The weightlessness of his legs hurt more than being on them, as they were wont to do. Groaning, Aedan rubbed his thighs firmly. "I'm warm, love. Do you see Thomas?" He craned his neck to look for the professor.
"Sight, my boy," came the voice from the shadows beyond the flickering firelight, "can be a lovely deception. Trust your instincts and your mind. They shall not fail you." Thomas stepped from the darkness and wiped a hand across his rain-slick forehead. A cascade of damp curls clung to his forehead, but his smile had never wavered. By the ears he held 5 rabbits, their glassy eyes caught in the firelight, but seeing nothing. He took a seat by the flames and pulled out a long hunting knife, setting to the task of skinning the creatures. The task took some time, but he completed it with few words, focusing as the light bled from the sky almost entirely. Reaching into his coat, he retrieved a small bundle of cloth tied at its corners and deftly freed it. Within, a small mound of blackberries and cleaned mushrooms gleamed in the firelight. From his own pack, Thomas fished out a pot and several other vegetables, onions, carrots, and celery that each maid laid out to dry from the damp in the glow Edalene had cast them. "You will remember only 2 meals of this expedition," Thomas told them quietly as he continued to prepare. "You will remember the first, with the scent of wood and loam thick in your nose, the promise of discovery thrumming in your chest, and you will remember the last. Successful or not, you will remember that the meal you have upon arriving home will be the best you've tasted in recent memory." Thomas retrieved a clay jug from his pack and poured the clear water into the pot, suspending it over the wood and poles with a few deft knots and an apparatus made from sticks. Into the pot went the ingredients, diced and intermingling. With a knowing wink, Thomas retrieved a small pouch and opened it gingerly, taking a pinch of ruby-red flakes and casting only a few into the water after the meat and vegetables. "We may eat many times, Cassian willing, during our travel, but only once will be the first, and only once will be the last. I can tell you the first and last meal of every expedition I've had." He patted the swell of his stomach appreciatively. "And I was fortunate to find a rabbit warren to share a stew with you tonight." Out came a ladle, wood, and carved of some unfamiliar dark complexion. He gave the pot a few stirs and stood. "Our food must be given some privacy to prepare. Edalene, my flower, see that the fire will not for want of fuel in our absence. We should be gone only 20. No," he cocked his head as if considering, 25 beats and 12 trills. He said the last looking at Edalene, as if the two of them shared some private joke, and dusted off his hands. "Step up and step lively. We cannot be on time if we do not rise to meet the schedule." Off the professor went, bobbing and ducking through the trees. He did not slow his pace for Aeodan, but did manage to always stay within the young man's sightline. Thomas went without lantern or torch, relying only on the starlight that had pierced the veil of clouds only a few breaks before. Edalene, slightly faster than her brother in the gloom, especially with her companion, almost ran into the professor. He stood stock still, gazing down at something in the gloom. "Ah, you've arrived. Splendid, splendid." He spoke quietly, reverently, and knelt. There was the sound of something striking against something else, and the glow of flame suddenly snarled into the light. Before them rose a curious object. Time had worn the stone to a shadow of its former self, but not enough so that the base could not be measured. Fully 12 feet in circumference, the remains of an ancient monolith struggled through the vines of the forest floor. In the roots around its base, bones had been laid, ritualistically. None of them were large enough to be human, and all appeared to be game animals of some kind. Thomas retrieved a bag from his cloak, the remains of the rabbits he'd skinned, including bones, and laid them out with the others. The blood gleamed in the light as he straightened. Long ago, this monolith was dedicated to Cassian, or a deity like him. It was a waypoint for travelers who came a long way, a kind of marker to indicate that their journey was nearly at an end, or... He turned and smiled at them, the light casting hollow shadows against his face, that it had just begun. He turned back to the monolith and drew a different blade from his coat, a much smaller one. With a deft stroke, he slid it along the back of his hand with a quiet hiss. Blood pooled immediately, and the professor turned his hand upside down to let it drip upon the stone and his offering. "An ancient custom," he explained. "In those days, travel was much harder. Gods and demons walked the lands in earnest, and most adventures ended far too early to finish even an opening chapter. To travel from one's home was to consign your fate to a higher power, and to form bonds with those you journeyed with. Back then, it was customary to offer the bones of your first meal at markers like these, and offer your blood to the deity that acted as guardian to it, so that you might win its protection." He drew his hand back and slid the knife back into the pocket, pulling a length of cloth and wrapping it quickly around his injured hand, careful not to jostle the lamp he had lit. He drew out the knife again and offered it first to Aeodan. "The blood is for the gods, the bones are for the road, and for your companions you must tell them a deep and terrible secret." He laughed then, suddenly breaking the enchantment he had cast with mirth. "Not that I imagine you have many terrible secrets between you. The custom dictated that a personal truth must be revealed to your companions. This truth must be in your mind when you shed the blood. Dishonesty is the ruin of any great adventure, and this sacrifice of truth ensures we will step with integrity. It is, of course, an old ritual, and neither of you must do anything. I find that to properly explore, I want to step into the shoes of those that tread before me, to know them better. I trust you will make the choice you are most comfortable with. He stepped away from the monolith to allow them both a chance to inspect it. Rather unorthodox. But then now you know why I'm not the chair of the department. He allowed himself a titter of mirth. We need not speak the truth here. I find stories of such weight are best in the company of good food. He left the lantern on the ground behind them and started off through the trees again. Follow the light. It should be dark enough to draw your path by the fire our delightful Edalene has made. I will return to administer our first meal, and you will both decide what truth, if there are any you can divulge, you are comfortable sharing. He paused. The darkness had nearly swallowed him now, and his voice seemed ominous, echoing. Remember, students, the power of a sacrifice relies on its importance. Give something of no weight, and you will find no weight returned. Give something of power, and expect that power will follow you. With those words, he left them, alone with the old monolith and the wind whistling through the trees.
Almost as soon as Aeodan asked, the professor appeared. Edalene whirled, confused by his sudden, soundless approach. Though the rain would have dampened the undergrowth, Edalene thought she surely should have heard some sign of his approach, though, of course, she didn't really have any knowledge of fieldcraft. She sent a bemused smile and a shrug to her brother at the professor's enigmatic wisdom. Seemed he had a fondness for proverbs. It was strange, but Edalene wasn't about to say anything to her employer. Can I help you with that? She asked, crouching by Thomas next to the fire. But he seemed content to work quietly, skinning the rabbits of their fur efficiently, the practiced hand of one who had done this many times before. As the sun darkened over the camp, the wind chill picked up. Edalene sent a glance to her brother, eager for him to come from the tent and sit by the fire. Even if it was in silence, it would be good for his pain to be by the warmth. If need be, she'd march over there and bring him to the fire. Honestly, sometimes it seemed that she was more concerned for his health than he was. Edalene was racking her head for something to say, something to break this awkward silence, when Thomas began to speak to the pair of them. She was briefly confused, wondering why they would only remember 2 meals. Was that a threat? Her spirit there rose up cautiously, but it seemed to be yet another proverb. Edalene stared at him, bewildered, but it actually made sense in a weird way. Perhaps, when Edalene and Aeodan were old and grey, they would speak beside a fire invited with warm memories of this strange stew that Thomas seemed to be making. She wondered how to reply, but then he shocked her. His flower? Irritation ran through her, and she nearly snapped at the unwelcome pet name. She hated being called such things by men who didn't know her. They didn't own her. She wasn't anyone's. She opened her mouth to say something, but then remembered he had employed her, simply closed her mouth and nodded tersely. A tight smile at the professor's joke, so he had noticed her mark. And she collected the fuel she had retrieved and began to pack the fire more tightly in preparation for their brief trip away. Ready, she murmured, standing and brushing the dirt from her dress. She held a hand out to her brother. Are you up to this, love? Edalene murmured to Aeodan. She wasn't trying to embarrass him, but his health came first and always would. No matter what he said, Edalene would take her brother by the hand, and match her pace with his as they walked through the forest, no matter how swiftly the professor forged ahead. It was a short walk through the dark forest, and Edalene nearly ran headlong into the professor. Sorry, sir, she murmured before looking around curiously. It seemed an innocuous part of the forest, and Edalene wondered how he had known it was here. Perhaps he had chosen the campsite for this very purpose. And then light, and she saw it. The obelisk was strange, worn down and vine-wrapped, bones littered around the obelisk, but organized as if they were meant to be there. Either there was a strange magic in the air here, or they were sacrificed. It was answered for her as the remains of their dinner were laid reverentially before the monument by the professor. He seemed less buoyant and more sincere in this place of old, strange power. Edalene felt her mark itch, and she was nearly compelled to step forward and touch the monument. This was a place of history. This place had the power of time. She considered arguing, refusing to cut herself for this old god, whoever it was. But one look to the obelisk and Edalene knew she had to honour history, even as she watched Thomas pour his blood onto the bones below. A small part of her worried for Aeodan, but this was about time and history, and Edalene could never say no to that. Edalene watched with a smile on her face, small and sincere, as the professor went back to the camp. And this time, not even his pet name bothered her. "I'll go first," she said suddenly into the silence. Edalene took the knife from her brother. She did not look at Aeodan as she stepped forward towards the monument, aware of the crunch of sacrificial bones before her. And another time, she might have questioned this, thought critically, argued, debated. But now, with the faith of the immortal of time in her, she knew she had to honor time and tradition. She drew a deep breath and focused on a terrible truth. There was only one she could think of, and Edalene knew that her brother would know what she was thinking. With a swift moment, she sliced the back of her palm, perhaps deeper than she needed to, and with Godrun's dying face in mind, she spilled her blood onto the monument. Closing her eyes, faces flashed through her mind. First, the shocked, gurgling face of Godrun as he fell. The smile of hope from Alan when she gave him that lie of a kiss. Aeodan and his tears when she told him. Ralaith and his presence of time. Tiartha, her soft smiles and colourful heart. And Narav, Narav, Narav. Always in between, Narav. Edalene breathed unsteadily and then stepped back. She mouthed a silent prayer to Ralaith. Wisdom, Ralaith. On this journey of time, I need to know what is wise stepping forward. Another moment, with a bleeding hand, she stepped back to her brother. With a hand that did not shake, Edalene held the knife out for her brother. "You don't have to do this, Aeodan," she murmured, looking for signs of pain. But then she paused. "But I'm glad that I did it."
From his angle, Aeodan still couldn't see the professor as he re-emerged from the tree line. His voice, though, prompted the younger twin to prop himself up on his elbows. Aeodan moved himself to the edge of the tent so that he could observe what Terence was doing. Interested in the field cleaning, Aeodan watched with fascination as the professor so skillfully cleaned and skinned the rabbits. As the rabbit flesh went into the stew with the rest of the ingredients, Aeodan moved closer to the fire, coming to sit next to his sister. He placed a pale hand on her arm, smiling contentedly as Terence spoke about the first and last meal. Something about it resonated within Aeodan, and his interest in the philosophy sparked something in him. "I like that. The first step of the journey is memorable for its beginning, and the last in its culmination." Aedan's voice was faint, and the awe was evident. There was something about the smokiness of the fire, the chill of the air on the parts of his body that the heat couldn't reach, and sharing this moment with the person he loved most in the world that awakened something in the brunette boy. A wide smile broke out on his face, and he leaned his head on Edalene's shoulder. The professor, for all his eclectic strangeness, was the perfect guide for this adventure, and Aeodan held a sense that all was well in the world. It wasn't without noting, though, that Aedan's sense of perfection was marred slightly by the professor's rapid and chaotic way of jumping from one subject to another. Almost as quickly as he'd returned, he was ready to be off. Aeodan smiled as Edalene offered him a hand up, and the two of them set off after the professor. As they walked, Aeodan held his sister's hand, lagging behind only slightly. "I'm not a baby anymore, Ida. I can handle a hike, just not so fast." The final clause was pitiful, especially since it was punctuated by Aeodan tripping over an exposed root. He had no idea how Professor Terence stepped so assuredly in the growing darkness, but he envied the exuberant man his sure-footedness. Leaning heavily on Edalene, he pulled himself back up. Luckily, his slow gait meant that he did not crash into the other two as they came to a stop. But he wouldn't have cared if he had. What rose before them was an ancient obelisk, weathered by time but untampered by man. The growth at its base, the bones laid around it. Aeodan felt the power of the place before he even understood what it was he was looking at. His breath caught in his throat, and for a few trills he forgot that oxygen was paramount to keeping him alive. With a gasp, he sharply inhaled and continued to stare at the monolith. As the professor stepped forward, Aedan's eyes flitted to him for the briefest moment before returning to the stone monument. Gods and demons, old deities and Cassian. The words washed over Aeodan, sinking into his body like the chill in the air. He grasped Edalene's hand, perhaps more tightly than he'd ever done so before. His hands were shaking, and not from the cold. Instead, the weight of the implication of the place had overwhelmed him, and once again, Aeodan forgot to breathe. In the moment, the ache of his legs vanished. His fear of failure vanished. The only things that remained were the off-kilter professor, the massive stone monument, the person he cherished most, and himself. The world melted around him, burning away to leave only the four of them, intertwined in the silken strands of fate. A single tear rolled from the boy's eye, and he made no effort to brush it away. At Terrence's offering, Aedan winced. He heard, all too clearly, the sound of the knife opening the man's hand. The blood did not bother him so much, but the sound caused him some discomfort. As the professor offered the knife, Aedan reached out instinctively and took it by the blade. He turned it over in his hand and admired the razor's edge of the weapon, a thin line of crimson from the professor's hand. A wave of fear gripped the boy, and he was unsure if he was more scared of the pain or the idea that he had no truth to offer the gods and demons. He clenched his jaw, struggling to beat back the tears that welled in his eyes. As she had done so many times in the past, Edalene came to his rescue, stepping forward to take the knife from his hand. Aedan stared at her back, entranced by the fluidity with which his sister took upon herself the responsibility of appeasing the world. He steeled himself as she cut her hand and watched her precious blood drip onto the bones after the professor's. Finally, it came his turn. On legs that were weaker than normal, Aedan stepped forward. He smiled weakly at Ida, trying as much to assure himself as he was her. "I am fine, dear sister." He held the blade in his hand, and a wave of emotion washed over him. He gritted his teeth and swallowed the rising bile, staring down at the droplets of crimson on the rabbit bones. Gripping the blade, Aedan focused on the deepest truth he had, drawing the sharp metal across his palm. He could feel every centimeter of skin separating, could feel the blood pooling along the surface of the laceration. He watched, transfixed, for a heartbeat before turning his hand over. As the first drop of blood fell from his hand, he concentrated on his truth, offering it wholeheartedly to the gods and the demons that were sure to plague his road. Turning, he wiped the blade on his pants and offered it back to the professor. "Let's go back, yes? I'm getting hungry and can smell the stew from here." He smiled again, pressing his palm onto his pants to stop the bleeding. He hooked an arm through Edalene's, and the two followed the professor back to the campsite.
As Aeodan turned from the obelisk, he did not see the faint, three-fingered hand that dipped from the stone as if the rock were no more than calm water to touch the place where his blood had fallen. 1,000 eyes watched the faintly luminescent arm bend. 1,000 mouths lay open as the strange, childlike figure slithered from the monolith to lap at the bits of blood the young scholar had left. It raised a head of drifting hair, thick as anemone tendrils, and each set with a tiny more of light, and smiled. And then it vanished. And the offered skulls spoke no words, content with their secrets. By the time they returned, they were greeted by the tantalizing aroma of the stew. Whatever the professor had added, with a wink and nod, lent a certain exotic fragrance to the rabbit and other vegetables cooking together. The fire crackled merrily on their return, and although distant thunder sounded over the trees, their camp had tried. Thomas sat first, leaning over the fire to stir the pot again. Curiously, the flames seemed to bend towards the portly man as if pushed by a strong breeze. No such wind existed, save for the one rattling above their heads along the branches. It was only for a moment, and then he settled with a smile. "Very avant-garde, my young scholars," Terence complimented when they also found their place at the fire. "Most at the university are content to study history at a distance, to marvel at it, talk at it, but I see you are more the type to leap head first into immersing yourself. I had my doubts, yes. I believe I did, but they're settled now." Standing, he pulled 3 more bundles of fabric from his mountainous bag and set them down in front of him. In one nestled 3 loaves of mahogany brown bread, festively pierced with roasted cloves of garlic. Although no doubt purchased that morning, the smell that rose from them was tantalizing. In the next, he uncovered a set of old wooden spoons. Careful craftsmanship had gone into their creation, but time had worn away some of the designs burned onto their handles. It appeared to depict an open road between 2 mountains. The last revealed the flaky skin of dried fish, gold tails from the port. The long fish didn't flash with the same brilliance it no doubt did when alive, but the fire glinted off the gilded scales as the professor snapped it into 3 pieces. Out came a dark wine bottle, bound in straw braids, which he uncorked with a small flourish. From a pocket he produced a 5th green bundle, where he drew out a quarter rind of butter-yellow cheese in a blue wax sheath. All of these he set beside him, before retrieving 3 bowls and 3 crimson napkins from a side pouch. Without a word, he ladled the stew, 3 heaping servings, into each bowl. He passed the first to Edalene with the tiniest bob of a bow and repeated the motion for Aeodan. His own bowl went directly in front of his crossed legs, close enough to be warmed by the fire. The wine followed, the blue-black liquid poured into 3 wooden goblets before being distributed. Thomas reviewed the scene, a meticulous host ensuring the sparse table was set as lavishly as able. With a snap, he drew 2 knives, separate from the ones they'd used to cut their hands, and presented them across the flames to both students. The fire seemed to part around his arms, and although they snatched the implements quickly, it was a marvel no one was burned. "Tomorrow we will sleep as late as we need to," he said, indicating the food. "Feast, please. Cassian is clear in his advice. Devour that you might face peril with a smile." A laugh, loud and booming in the quiet around them. I suppose Cassian says many things, but they all seem to follow the theme of eating well and living well. Clearly. He drummed his own prominent guts. I need little prompting. But you will find, my young scholars, that when you pitch your tent and walk the miles and kindle the fire, almost all food tastes better. Earned. Eyeing them slyly across the blaze, he held out a hand. There's no pomp and ceremony between the travel-dusted. Enjoy. He dove into his own stew, chomping and sighing around his bites. His joy was infectious, and it seemed as though the more Terence enjoyed his meal, the better it tasted to the twins. The Djinn brought the attention of a fox peering suspiciously from the shadow of a yew tree behind them. Spying it, Thomas fished a sliver of rabbit meat from his stew and tossed it toward the creature. Although the fox danced away at first, it appeared shortly after and devoured it with a sharp, jerking bob. Professor Terence passed the other items around the fire to the twins, remarking here and there with little insights into the origin and preparation of the food. "Oh," he would say, "this particular bread is a favorite of mine. The young maiden who makes it has wheat gold hair and always remembers the names of her customers." Or, "Nishaki cheese. It's a Colby, I believe, but a spice Colby called Iktet. Very popular and rather common in the sands, but here, well, let's say it costs a pretty nell to acquire." And, "Blackberry wine. Yes, I know. Quite rare to find the proper vinting. I believe it's a port? Yes, a sweet aroma. Nahar to be specific, near Millstone north of the city." As the feast wore down and Thomas doled out the remainder of the stew, he sat back contented and belched. It rumbled out of him, startling the fox, who had been gnawing on a scrap of fish and sending it scurrying away into the darkness. The fire was blazing merrily, and Thomas rolled in the last of the wood Edalene had collected. As the conversation began to settle, he danced his fingers against his stomach and sighed, leaning forward. "Most travelers would speak their truth aloud to each other at the Waystone," he said. When the words had been spoken, they would, in turn, swear their honesty and courage for the journey ahead. Not all participated in the ritual, of course. Some who didn't lived, and some who did died. In the grand scheme of history, we are all footnotes, skulls and offerings, so it is sometimes hard to know what does and doesn't work. He didn't look at either of them, but instead at his hands, smiling distantly. We live in the cherished moment of now. Rayleigh preserves the past, and zeal predicts the future. But no man or God can know for sure. Between the twins, Terence brought a small smirk, and then returned his gaze to the flames. "These days, they tell us scholars are learned men who spend their time digging through tomes in solemn universities." Thomas shook his head once, violently, and chuckled. "You are both young enough to choose whether that destiny defines you. Me? Why, I seek history where scholars fear to tread. There is a place for those who like to read about the adventures of others, and you won't see me snubbing Professor Finnegan just because he's never been off Ruinfall." His tone of voice suggested he might. "But if you truly wish to discover, to experience, to know, you must put your very lives in danger, become part of the tapestry, and leave your mark on the pages you write." He straightened and shook his head, laughing again. But look at me prattling away. Our lovely Madame Fire has provided us such warmth tonight. It would be a shame to let her dwindle without the weight of our tales to lull her slumber. So," he looked up at them, "it is time to tell our truths." Thomas Theodore Terence was not a tall man. In height, he stood below Aeodan, and his girth surpassed them both. But somehow in the firelight he seemed to tower, made majestic by the wild embers and glittering stars. An owl hooted somewhere above them, and Thomas tipped his head to acknowledge the audience. For me to tell you my truth, I must explain my shame. When I was a young man, little older than yourselves, I found myself on the doorstep of the Andaris University without a single knell to my name. Thomas cleared his throat and burped again, startling a chuckle out of him. Well, I suppose I did have knells, but nothing approaching the tuition necessary to admit me. I was a traveler in those days, a bard who traded tunes and tales for drink and food along taverns and inns across half of Idyllis. Fishing out the small pan flute on a chain around his neck, he rubbed it and smiled gently, his eyes somewhere else. I needed to be admitted to the university, but a bard has little academic acumen to his name and no reason to beg the mercy of the scholars and the teachers. They took young folks of promise then, and still do now. It's a bit bureaucratic these days, but all things stagnate, becoming that way in time. He shook off the criticism and continued, leaning forward. One thing you can count on a bard to be is a careful liar. I knew nothing of history then, not more than the tales I had learned on the road. I was a student, yes, but not of that. Thomas frowned and sat back, shifting on the dirt. There was a young man studying for his doctorate, Caleb Mave, who would often come to the tavern I sang in to drink his frustrations. Looking away, Thomas seemed guilty and coughed. An agreeable man, Caleb, but a bit dry. He was working on something impressive, he would always say, something grand. It was a historical retelling of Rinmir's nobility pieced together from servant accounts and certain forgotten records. He was to call it, and here Thomas spread his hands wide, drawing an invisible arc, Decadence and Decline, a study of nobility. Edalene and Aeodan knew this title well, and suddenly Thomas Theodore Terence was clear to them. A prized book, a scholarly pursuit that had won the university funding from the crown and scathing criticism from the landed gentry, was tasked with such a title. The prose, while a little dry, had been insightful and keen, swift and well-balanced. As a piece of work, it was widely admired, enough so to make it into the curriculum of many historical classes. Thomas seemed to mark the recognition with saccharine amusement, turning his gaze back to the fire. A young bard with nothing can be desperate, and Caleb drank heavily. One night while he slumbered, I stole to the small room he rented and absconded with every page. His smile had soured into a frown, and he pushed his hands together. 5 days to read every page and memorize. 5 days to craft the compelling lie I would need to tell. All the time I expected Caleb to come for me, to bring the iron hand, but nothing. Thomas took his cup of wine and swirled it, sipping. Caleb left the university, I heard later, took a passage to Nahar. His ship never made harbor, found without a crew and marked with the chalk of a Mer tribe 14 days after it, was marked missing. Thomas turned his eyes up and sighed. We make mistakes when we are young, things we wish we could snatch away from history, things we want to rewrite. After a moment, he returned his attention to the twins. My greatest accomplishments at the university was another's. Oh, I've written fabulous things since. I would talk for hours about Rinmir folk religion or the second emergence of Rinalism. But everyone always wants to talk about the nobility, and it is the one work that I cannot claim as my own. He pondered that a moment and finally shrugged. Caleb had a mother, 6 arcs past now, lived outside Andaris. I sent her money, kept her relatives comfortable, and would find a time to visit every week to hear her stories. I never told her the truth, and sometimes I feel like the guilt might hollow me out inside. Setting the cup down, his eyes found the firelight. In somber sorrow, his form had shrunk, and now he seemed so very small and old, more so than he had ever looked before. Regret is a poison we drink slowly, he told them. Live happy, live furious, live as the best of us or the worst of us, but never nurse that bottle. Shaking his head, Thomas poured a little more into his cup and swallowed it down. The gods will sort us when we die, but to leave too much frozen that way, trapped in regret. He looked across the fire at both of them. It's the only ruins we never seem to unearth. Here, Thomas took a deep breath. I could have waited, you know. I could have studied and worked to find entry to that university, but I urgently needed to be there. Now I will tell you my truth, the truth that I must entrust you with. Even armed with my story, it would be difficult to discredit me. But what I am to tell you now could end with the last necklace a criminal ever wears. He drew a hand across his throat and grinned. When I was 12, my father sat me down to explain who he was. Back then, we had already traveled much from the tiny village I was born into, south of Etsus. He told me that he was a seeker and that my lineage and destiny was to become one like them. Thomas held out both his hands against the fire as if examining them. A mage, worker of will and dazzle. He plunged both hands into the fire, which twisted and danced around them. In amazement, they watched the flames travel up his arms, leaving him untouched, and then scurried back into the bosom of embers with a small cloud of ash. Thomas waited for them a moment before continuing. The Seekers are an organization across Idolus. Not so large now as it was, and not so secret in some places. We study magic, learn it, and add our knowledge to that of our teachers to build a greater understanding as a whole. Or, he shrugged, that's the basic idea. I was initiated by my father and 2 others. I was initiated by my father and 2 others, 3 magics for young Thomas Theodore Terrence. Of all the things I do, it was perhaps what I was best at. Still am, perhaps. But these times are dangerous to be a mage in. He drew back from the fire. There are those who misuse magic, who hurt others, who become nothing more than an extension of that power. Sometimes that's the Seekers, and most often it's the Coven, led by a lich named Ellison. His face looked hollow, sicker somehow. It was why I was sent to Ruinfall, to infiltrate the college and seek out the Coven inside. The Seekers worried Ellison had managed to sway a respected faculty to send new recruits to her chapter in Ruinfall, build her power. He shivered. They were correct, but that is a tale for another time. Something off in the forest crashed through some underbrush, but Thomas did not flinch. He only looked into the flames. Most mages lose themselves eventually, become what they study. It isn't like history. It's alive. I'm telling you this. I'm telling you this truth, children, because where we are going is a dangerous place. I would have brought my faithful Daisy, my sunbeam, but she's with child. I did not warn you of the danger because you would not heed it, I think. He looks between the 2 of them. And I wanted you to enjoy your first meal completely. Tomorrow we will go to a place where survival is not certain, but knowledge is. I need you to know that I will not hold back my capabilities if we are to go to that place. I cannot, for your sakes and mine. He settled back again, lacing his fingers across his stomach. Now, you may pack in the morning and leave. I will sleep late, as I often do before danger, and if you are still here when I wake, if you tell me your truths, we will go together and you will share all that we discover. If not, I will not hurt you. Thomas smiled, but it was touched with sorrow. Old men grow weary of inflicting pain. A poet said that once, much prettier in her native tongue, but you get the idea. He closed his eyes then and dipped his head back against the pack he rested on, clearly comfortable with allowing them to continue or go their separate ways.
Edalene watched in silence as her brother stepped forward with a slight shake on unsteady legs. She was ready to step in at a moment's notice, to catch her brother should he fall or faint, but she knew Aeodan needed to do this on her own. Belatedly, she realized that perhaps she had been too coddling on this journey. She kept asking him what he needed, if he was okay, perhaps even embarrassing him in front of the professor. Her head bowed. She resolved to let him be more independent, but that went against her very nature, everything that she stood for. She looked up as Aeodan returned and took his hand effortlessly. This time she walked slowly, but she did not glance to Aeodan every so often, only helping him if needed or asked. It was as though there was a magnet inside of her, pulling her to Aeodan, and Edalene struggled against the very pull. Surely one day she would be unable to resist it and snap back to him, but for now she fought against it, trying to let Aeodan breathe and blossom on his own. He was immensely capable, Edalene knew, and had more steel than anyone she knew. For once, Edalene was going to let him wield it on its own. Coming back to the site, Edalene sat gracefully and accepted the food with a murmur of thanks. But then, "Oh, wine!" she exclaimed before blushing. "Sorry," she stammered, blushing a little. I just didn't expect such delicacies on an expedition, I suppose." She took a draught of the wine easily, feeling warmed and content by the fire. Even with the cut on her hand that matched the others, she still felt whole and at ease, even knowing the secret truth that she held inside of her. It helped that Aeodan knew, but with good food and wine in her belly, she felt at ease in this group, even with the very eccentric Thomas beside them. And then it was time for truths. Edalene felt her stomach twist, but she breathed deep, taking strength from her brother beside her. It was just that, a truth. Aeodan already knew, and Thomas's opinion meant little to her. Briefly, she thought of the night before. The ghost was set to rest, and the story was as well of an end as it could be, with the press of Narav's kiss on hers. A smile in memory, and a smile at the professor mentioning Raleigh, as she turned to Thomas and prepared to listen, grateful that he was sharing first and setting the tone. Edalene was surprised by his beginnings, but said nothing until, with a jolt, he mentioned the title. "But I know that book," she blurted suddenly. "It's central to my thesis." A glance from the professor and she settled, letting him finish his story, but anger seethed inside of her. To her, a historian, this academic fraud was fundamentally wrong to her. For Edalene, she worked hard every day, and she had not received any great renown or praise yet. Unlike Aeodan, a nasty thought set in her head, but she ignored it. But fraud? It was a heinous crime to her. But she could not say anything. She pursed her lips. She had spilled blood before gods and demons, and this was a place to share shames and truths, not to judge them. She said nothing, though she desperately wanted to, and let him continue with another. Her eyebrows raised. She thought they only needed to share one, and what could be more terrible than the first? And oddly, even as she watched his hands dance with the flames where they surely should have burnt alive, she could not bring herself to care, still enraged at the first truth. It was unreasonable, but she was so focused on the heinousness of academic fraud that the secret he was a mage, corrupted from the inside, meant little to her. He finished his tale and allowed them to tell their own, and to prevent herself from arguing with Thomas, she spoke. "I'll tell," said Edalene suddenly. Aeodan already knows this, but there are parts he does not. "This is for you, Thomas, so do with it what you will." The way she used his given name and the tone, it was almost a threat. Out her, and she'd out him, and to her his crime was more heinous than hers. She began to speak, and held the professor's gaze steadily, as if to challenge him to react. Raise a fist, douse her in flames, end her. If he did so, he would be branded a hypocrite. "Long ago, I loved a boy. I suppose I still do and always will. His name is Narav, and he was an accident. I should never have met him and loved him, but it turned out that way. He was the son of a sailor, and so he never stayed in Ruinfall. If he had, our relationship, I imagine, would have blossomed, and none of this would have happened. I blame it on the restlessness of children. We were 16, not too long ago, and we had a friend. His name was Alan. I met him in school, and Narav befriended him. There was a lot more rivalry between them than I realized at the time. I know it sounds arrogant," and she blushed, "but it's true. Narav loved me, and Alan wanted me. I did not realize either, but they did, and there was tension." She shook her head and swallowed, getting back on track, taking a draught of wine to bolster her. "Alan, his father was a knight. He was also a drunkard and abuser. With some convincing, I managed to get Narav to help me stage a plot to get him to stop. He would leave Alan with marks and bruises everywhere, and I couldn't handle it. Narav, he didn't want to be involved, but I convinced him." A wry smile. None of this would have happened if Narav had not loved her. "We we called it a prank. We faked a letter and lured Godrin, Alan's father, to the gate of his dead wife. There I dressed up as a bride from the dead, and Narav slicked the stairs with oil." She took a deep breath, and here looked at Aeodan. He knew, and he offered his love, but still she wanted forgiveness. He was only supposed to be scared, and that fear would stop him from abuse. But as he slipped, he hit his head on a gravestone, and his skull was caved in. and I needed to retrieve evidence. I went to Alan's house and made him believe I loved him too, so I could steal back the letter. Oddly, I feel more shame about that fake relationship than I do the death of his father. And here she spoke only to Aeodan. But last night, Narav is back. We went and we reburied Godrin. I found out that Narav, he'd had to kill Godrin, as somehow he had lived through a caved-in skull, and he'd buried him in an unmarked grave. But last night, we set him to rest in a grave with his name and Narav. Edalene smiled, but said nothing of the kiss. A beat of silence, and she turned to Thomas. And that is my truth. Not as grand as yours, I'm afraid, but there it is. Bitterness washed over her, and she stared into the fire. It was Aeodan's turn. She did not know what he was going to share. What truth was there that Edalene did not already know?
Aedan's pace was steadier now, as if emboldened by the show of fearlessness. Though he supposed it wasn't fearlessness, since his guts hadn't stopped twisting since he'd spilled the blood. So eager to return to the campsite, he saw nothing of the monument's acceptance of his gift. Instead, he saw the worried look of Edalene, so mixed with another emotion, pride perhaps, and returned it with a smile. His hand gripped hers in a tight, reassuring manner, and they made their way back to the camp together. To his credit, Aeodan was more careful and ensured that he did not stumble again. No, on this night, he would be the strongest he'd ever been. The professor had demanded of them honesty, and now Aeodan was being honest with himself. No more would he allow his weakness to be his crutch. No more would he lay blame on his physical maladies when it was the fear curled inside of him, petrifying his innards if he even so much as thought about it. Just the realization sent chills down the boy's spine. The thought, though, was washed away in the scent of the stew and the professor's meticulous habit of finishing and doling it out. As he did so, Aeodan ensured that Edalene received the first bowl. He pulled from one of the loaves a hearty chunk and offered it to her, smiling. He knew that Edalene loved to eat, and Aeodan certainly was no cook. He could fry almost anything in pork fat, but to make a stew as tantalizing and decadent as the one that was spooned into the bowl before them, he couldn't offer Eda anything like that. So with a smile, he catered to everything his sister needed, going so far as to provide her with the utensils since she couldn't reach. Aeodan accepted his own dish with a thankful smile and a murmur, assuring the professor of both his manners and his thankfulness of assuaging his rumbling stomach. His own hunk of the appetizing garlic bread was pushed down into the bowl, and Aeodan watched thoughtfully as it absorbed the thick broth. A smile turned the corners of his lips as the bread soaked, and soon he spooned the succulent soup into his mouth. Tender chunks of rabbit, the perfect hint of salt and spice, and the bread. A groan escaped Aedan's mouth, and he expressed his delight at the flavors in his bowl by wolfing down the first and helping himself to a second. So interested was he in the stew that the cup of wine sat, untouched and forgotten. Aedan slurped the last of his soup from the wooden bowl and rested back on his elbows, sighing in contentment. He closed his eyes as he waited for the other two to finish their meals, and his mind drifted off. With his eyes closed, he could see the massive obelisk, the bones of the sacrifices laid around it in their meticulous fashion. He saw, as if he were the droplet of blood, his own crimson life force fall, splashing over the stark bone of the rabbit. He saw, for the first time, the shadowed claw emerge from the stone, as if pushed through wet clay, scraping at the bloodied calcium. His heart thumped in his chest, and before he knew it, he was jerked away. Whether it was by the professor's own startling laugh or the horrors of his dream, Aedan sat bolt upright with widened eyes. He shook the sense of foreboding from his thoughts and turned his attention to the professor. A thin hand picked up the carved wooden spoon, and he idly twirled it between his fingers as Terence started to reveal his truth. Aedan admired the charred depiction on the wooden handle, feeling as if he were the tree itself, carried through the flame and emblazoned with the freedom of another life. A tree could never travel the path between the mountains, but in its current form it likely had. In his travels, Professor Terence had likely taken this specific tree to many great and wondrous locations. The sheer weight of tremendous travel weighed on Aedan's mind as the young man observed the wood. He listened to Terence's story about stealing the work of a fellow colleague, and immediately disgust rose in the man's throat. But why? Who was he to judge the man sitting before them, the man whose laurels were built on a lie but were laurels nonetheless? Would a scholar be less admired for expanding on a topic though he wasn't the one to discover it? Would a smith be chastised for learning how to purify iron more efficiently, though the method of purification was not his? No. And Aedan, though it brought a strange taste to his mouth, could not judge Professor Terence for his transgressions. The text was very familiar to the brunette boy, though perhaps not as centrally as his sister. Still, he tried to reserve his judgments, if for no other reason than to not color his choices on this expedition. More interesting to Aedan was the professor's real truth, the reason behind his blatant theft of academic property. He'd heard rumors of the Seekers, a secret sect of mages dedicated to perfecting and mastering their respective disciplines. Often they were portrayed negatively, the antagonists of Idalos as a whole and the assassins of those who would seek to undo them. But the professor did not seem to Aedan to be particularly dangerous, though the boy admitted he likely wouldn't have been able to tell even if he had known what it was he was looking for. Instead, Aedan saw what drew him in the professor, a curiosity that couldn't be sated, not even by pursuing and acquiring the desired knowledge. There was always something more to be discovered, something more to be seen and explored. Aedan could sense that in the professor, and perhaps that's why he was so eager to rise to the professor's challenge. As Terence finished, Aedan remained silent. He rested his dark eyes on the man, and they were not clouded by judgment. Instead, he tried to see him with understanding, and a simple nod slipped from Aedan to Thomas, showing him that no words of hate were forthcoming. He flipped the spoon over again in his hand, remembering suddenly that it remained there. It was a nervous habit, something that became more prevalent as he thought about it. He set the wooden spoon down on the ground by his bowl and smiled. He knew Edalene would go next, though he need not prompt her to do so. And it was not long before his theory was tested and proven true. Aedan already knew his sister's darkest secret, and he knew how much it pained her. But he also knew his sister, and in her threatening tone to the professor, he knew she was protecting herself, and by proxy him. But even the tranquil scent of the woods, the hanging of the willows, and the chill wind could take from his sister her fire. She was, even by firelight, stronger and more full than Aedan ever had been. As she began her tale, Aedan rested a hand on her thigh. His show of support was all he could offer as she spoke to the world her truth, and his eyes watched the professor for a reaction. Aedan, though, was surprised by Narav's presence in the region. Last he'd heard, the man was afar, sailing and causing his sister immense loneliness. His fingers clenched instinctively, and he dug his trim nails into his sister's flesh. Recoiling immediately, he drew his hand to his lap and sat it there, biting on his lip. He was happy, somewhere under the miasma of feelings he was feeling, for his sister. She could finally lay the horror to rest and learn to come to terms with herself. But bile rose in his throat at the thought of Narav being with his sister, and he was not there to protect her. A clenched jaw was the only defense he had now. And then she had finished her truth. It echoed inside Aedan's mind, and his heart steadily upped its tempo. Blood rushed to his face as he realized that the time had come. The paralyzing fear froze his insides, and Aedan was sure their crystalline structure would shatter under the pressure his stomach was asserting. Vomit welled in his chest, burning the bottom of his throat and threatening to reveal itself before he could reveal his truth. He pushed it down, swallowing the fear and steeling himself. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. A frustrated sigh escaped first, and it was a full 2 bits of silence before Aedan began. I was born differently than those like me. When I was born, my legs were twisted and ruined, and the surgeons told my mother and father that it was unlikely I'd ever walk. The girl, they said, is fierce and strong as the bear. The boy, though, he won't make it the winter. And truth be told, sometimes I wish I hadn't. I know, Ida, that you will scold me for, but my existence has made yours so much more difficult, and were it not for me, your life could have been different. Aedan didn't dare look at Edalene. Instead, he kept his eyes planted firmly on the waning fire and the glowing embers. The flickering plasma made strange shapes in his eyes as tears welled in them, refracting the light in awkward shapes. And so I grew. And so too did my sister, and she became my keeper. Our parents, they were busy with their work, and often it was just Edalene and I. She would cook for me, clean after me, ensure that I had studied and bathed. She would undress me and carry me to the bath in my cloak of misery and shame. She would dry my tears and hold me while I sobbed, all the while wishing that my spirit would shrivel as my legs had. And in all that time, she would assure me that my legs were not useless. She would tell me that my strength dwelled within, and that if I truly wanted my legs to work, they would. And when we turned 7, she began to help me reconstitute myself. His voice cracked and held back tears. He swallowed the hard rock in his throat, taking a deep breath to steady himself. Instead, it was shaky and he could hear his heart pounding in his ears. He still dared not look at his sister. So we spent every bit of every trial together, relying on each other for guidance and support. When she flowered, I comforted her. When I was made fun of by the ruthless children, she consoled me. We were each other's refuge and each other's confidant. And with every passing trial, my love for her grew. I came to appreciate and crave her company. I strove to improve my condition so that no matter what, I could show her that every bit she put into helping me would not go to waste. And as my ambition grew, so too did my love. So too did my desire to be everything she needed me to be. I would replace the hurt in her life with love, something so pure that our parents could not understand, something so fulfilling that the thought of Narav would burn from her memory. I wanted to be everything she'd ever need, as she had been for me my entire life. And suddenly he grew stronger. And every move I've made since that trial has been in pursuit of that goal, as taboo as it is. Every book I've read, every word of all 6 languages I speak, every restless break poring over dusty, old tomes. They have all been to show Edalene that she need not look any further than me for her needs. I have become the man I am today in pursuit of Edalene's love. And though I will never deserve it in the capacity that I want, I will always strive to make it so. And with that, Aedan's eyes finally found his sister's. In the eternity of a trill, he held her gaze, tears silently flowing from his eyes as they pleaded with her not to find him abhorrent. His lips quivered as he held back the sob that grew in his throat, but he demanded from himself that he remain strong in this crucial moment. He loved her so much that his heart was shattering and repairing with every bat of her eyelashes. In the eternity of that trill, the woods, the ruins, the obelisk, the meal, the wine, the professor, it all vanished, and she was all he could see, all he would ever see.
There are moments, amber moments, a Rarn poet had written, where time becomes a capsule and trills were set in the bedrock of eternity. There are choices, fulcrum decisions on which the history of a relationship twists and turns to find balance. There are words. And, after all, are words not history itself? Do we not speak our realities into the dark and pray it echoes back? Save for the crackle and pop of the waning fire, no one spoke. Respectful of the silence, the fire seemed to quiet as well. Edalene's face was lost in shadow as her creation dwindled, leaving only the glisten of her eyes set in a frozen silhouette. Aeodan vanished as well, the night eating him bit by bit till only his pale hand was left to bask in the warmth, still with confidence. Thomas remained lit, his expression inscrutable. He was wood, carved into the shape of the rotund scholar by unseen hands. Even the owl fell silent, and the entirety of the forest seemed to hang on the hush of Aedan's last word. Amber moment. 3 in company, frozen in the truths they told. Thomas closed his eyes and spoke, shattering the eternity, although less than a bit had passed. On the Ivorian Sea, there was a clan of Bakai I had the honor of sailing with once. They were a carefree people, generally, but their tempers changed with the winds. They say Ufric made them from the drowned with sea foam and joy. He fell silent a moment, his body shifting in the guttering glow. I bartered my passage from an island where a questionable drunken decision had left me stranded. They called themselves the Nijihadi, which in the Rakahi tongue means seeker of dreams. Their clan has sailed the seas for centuries. They allowed me to see their lineage knot, a rope where every firstborn child would tie a knot when they were old enough to do so. Were you aware that the Bakai are well known for siring twins? He reached out as the fire fell to a wistful tongue, and it slipped into his palm, happily popping into a small blaze again. The captain of the ship I traveled on, the Land Bird, once introduced me to his wife. a great honor for an outsider like myself. His free hand rubbed the stubble growing on his chin, teasing a thumb over it, transfixed by the blaze. Before he did, though, he seemed worried and told me a story. It is not my story to tell, but I will give you the gist. The captain was born one of two. His sister was born with the sea inside her, temperamental, capricious, mighty, and beautiful. He was born with the land inside instead, stubborn, strong, commanding, and vast. Thomas chuckled at vast and shrugged. Vast, he says, the mage assured them, contains multitudes. Thomas tipped the last of the wine into the wood cup and sipped at it quietly, the fire ever dancing around his fingers. They grew up on the same ship, weathered the same storms, fought the same battles, and when his people came to him to choose a bride, he would think of none other than his dear sister. Thomas regarded them, and despite the light only illuminating him, both had the feeling he could see them in the darkness. "We are one soul," he told me. Just like that. Thomas thumped his chest with his free hand, curled into a fist. "When we join, it is one mighty spirit of land and water that leads our clan." Sighing, he settled back against his pack and looked up, smiling at the stars winking above them. He told me because he was afraid I would not understand. I am a bard, and he thought a story would be necessary to buy my acceptance. The professor did not look down to them. Instead, the fist loosened and trembling fingers dug around the chains and threads that hung around his neck until he found one in particular. It was not the pipes, but a plain brass ring turning on the end of a knotted cord. His fingers found it and clasped it so tightly they were bloodless. "My young friends, you are too new into this world. I envy the adventures and roads that lie before you, the adversaries you will contend with, the discoveries you will make. Realith knows I've made mistakes. They all know. But the greatest I've ever made is underestimating the value of love." He said the words like a prayer and took a bellowing breath, suddenly, hitching for a moment and then sighing it away. Perhaps there was a tear, perhaps just the glisten of his eyes in the fire he held. "In Vidin, there is a tree just outside the city. You will find it if you look, due north about 20 or so bits from the gate. It will be the largest of the trees you see that crowd the road, but as you draw closer, you will notice something peculiar." Thomas's voice was soft, so soft it was almost whisper. Almost. Not quite. "It is not one tree, but two. Seeds grown together. One seed was weaker. You can see that in its growth along the right side. But when it was joined with the other, why, it sprang to the tops of other trees. It's been arcs since I've been there. Perhaps they've cut it down. If you examine it, you'll find initials tattooed across its bark, carved through the years by hopeful couples praying their marriage would last. Once upon a time, it held religious significance, and now they repeat the ritual without understanding the meaning. No love comes without sacrifice. It's no different than the obelisk. The greater the sacrifice, the greater the power. Once upon a time, I carved my initials with another on that tree, but I didn't respect the ritual. I did not give enough." He fell quiet, shaking his head. "Enough truths for one evening, I think," he said at last, sighing and rising to his feet. "You've much to talk about, I'm sure, but I would suggest you wait till the morning. Remember that if you choose to remain here when I strike camp, we will be stepping into a territory more dangerous and wondrous than any you've seen before. You will need your strength. The Waystone ritual is at an end. I will swear my honesty and bravery to your safety and our mission. If you remain, I will withhold nothing. If you go, I will wish you a safe return." He pulled his pack up with him, retreating away with the small blaze still held on the palm of his hand. Thomas paused as he passed Edalene, looking down. His face might have been terrible in the light, but it was merely weary instead, with a small encouraging smile on its lips. "We bandy the word justice, as though it were an absolute. Murderers fill the pages of your histories, and yet many of them we honor. Consider that most children would not return to rebury a victim, perhaps not deserving of mercy. Consider what you believe your penance to be. Do what you must to avoid a gulp of regret, my dear. You'll never stop drinking." He passed her then, stepping away to the edge of the campsite and placing the tiny fire on his shoulder. In silence, he pitched his tent and crawled inside, leaving them in the night. The forest seemed to remember its song then, picking up with the sounds of hoots and howls once more. Ash remained where the fire had once roared, and its heat crept away from them slowly. All that remained was the thrumming of their hearts and the proximity of their bodies, and the heat of the spoken words between them.
Adalene's heart grew warm as the fire as Aeodan began his truth. She obviously did not remember the beginning of his story, but she felt the truth of it, their parents doubtful as they were. They had encouraged Edalene from a young age to reach her greatest potential, but never Aeodan. His legs were crippled and ruined, and they had never expected him to amount to anything. Their hopes rested solely on Edalene. But she had never discounted him, he who meant so much to her, he who had defined their purpose, he who had given Edalene a life. She reached out a hand and grasped the knee that had been prophesied to be ruined. He still struggled on those legs, but he had done so well. As he spoke, a warmness flooded through her. Everything she said, she felt. She loved him, and he loved her. And that was all that mattered. But as he spoke, unease settled through her belly. Things he was saying, they didn't sit right. But what worried her most of all was simple. They always spoke to each other. Even when others were present, the world revolved around the two of them. It was always the twins, Edalene and Aeodan, running circles around everyone who was present. In this campfire, though, Edalene looked at Aeodan, unable as she was to address the fraudulent professor, and he would not look at her. But everything he was saying, it seemed right and wrong. But no, it was wrong. Her jaw dropped. She realized what she was saying. As he spoke about the undressing and the crying, everything took on a new light. To be everything Narav could not be, but he had kissed her yesterday. She withdrew the hand from his knee and drew it to her own and could not look at him. Bile rose in her throat. How could she have been so blind? Everything he said, of course it made sense, and she heard the tears in his eyes clogging his throat, but still she stared into the flames she had started. She had no words. This all made no sense, and it made every sense. At the end of Aeodan's truth, she drew a jagged breath and said nothing. She could not listen to him. She would not. No. Thomas began to speak, but she did not listen. Something about a Bacage and the sea and other twins, but all that mattered to her was Aeodan. Did she care if Thomas, the eccentric, the liar, the fraud, had met other twins who loved each other? Their decision did not influence her own. They meant nothing. Truly, the taboo did not matter. Her parents did not care. It was simple. Her and Aeodan, were they true emotions? Were they meant to be together? Even his words of Vidon, the place they were meant to go, with Duncan no less, the man she knew would love her brother, did not rouse her from her focus of the fire. No, it was that warm body next to her, her center of gravity, that despite the sacrifice and the woods and the night drew her whole attention. Edalene was aware of his stare, his breath, everything, though she could not return it. And then Thomas went to bed. Silence reigned. She cared for nothing, watching the flame crackle down, words dry on her tongue. What could she say? And yet when she heard him speak, there were words that she thought she might say, but they were alone. No one could see them, hear them now, but words were up to her. So much was always up to her. How long? She asked raggedly, still staring into the fire. How long have you felt this way? A terrible gasp went through her. Aeodan, I told you everything. I gave you everything. Did you never think, never feel I might feel the same way? Did you think it was only you, ever? A sob racked through her. She did not look at him. Narav, she paused. Narav, it always came down to that elusive man. If I had known before him, I would have looked no further. You are everything. And here she looked at him. Her brown eyes were filled with tears, mirroring his own, twins to the last. Why? She sobbed. Do you think I cared, cleaned, looked after you out of obligation alone? Because you were my brother? Did you think so little of me? Her shoulders shook as she spoke. Do you think if I only knew you for the rest of my life, I would be unhappy? That you were not enough? She reached out. Edalene grabbed her brother's shoulders and looked at him closely, her eyelashes almost brushing his. Aeodan, she breathed, and a tear broke over her cheek, and she shook it away. Aeodan. Edalene murmured like a prayer, but there was nothing else she could say. Her arms drew around her brother's shoulders, and she kissed him on the lips, as a lover would, and only the sigh that escaped her lip would mark her as content. This she wanted. But now that her brother finally had it, who knew what he would do?
Thump, 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 thump. He knew each beat was a trill, or maybe a half trill, but time lost its meaning. The world lost its sound. The is became was, and all that was left was Aedan and Edalene. Aedan stared at Edalene, waiting for her to return his gaze, agonizing in his anticipation. The professor, whose demeanor never stuttered, watched the two of them in their angst. He gave them their time, allowed them their intimacy, but knew that the show must carry on. Njihadi. Immediately, Aedan recognized the syllables, seeker of dreams. Aiden's interest was piqued by this strange seafaring clan, and he turned his attention to the professor. The clan was notorious for twins, and Aedan's mind seemed to catalog it as soon as he heard it. In the future, he would seek out this clan and speak with them. Perhaps their experience could help him temper his own. Seeing Edalene's response, perhaps they could teach him how to sever the feelings completely. Each word the professor said clung to Aedan's skin like morning dew, and soon they hardened into an armor of story that Aedan would use to get through the tumult raging in his veins. He let the experience of the professor wash over him, and when the man went to bed, Aedan's heartbeat had returned to a more normal rhythm, though looking back at his sister sent it back into a frenzy. Heat rippled across his skin, as if the professor had sent the embers of the dying fire into his own clothing. Were it not for the chill of the night, Aedan's skin might have been glistening with sweat, though he could not identify why. Instead, though, it sent shivers down his spine as he awaited Edalene's response. He watched like a hawk her breathing, changing from sharp, shallow breaths to those more suited to speech. Suddenly, his heart lurched again, and his legs felt as if their weight would descend through the soil and into the center of the world. Perhaps it would bury Aedan there, where his feelings would be encased in molten rock and esoterica. How long? How could she ask him to put a timestamp on his love for her? She with the favor of Raliath. Could she not traverse the cloud of time to see when his love for her started? Could she go back further than the embryo? Aedan supposed that the type of love he felt for his sister was outside the purview of time, and thus immeasurable by quantifiable system. Biting his lip until it bled, Aedan's eyes snapped to his sister, accusatory in their mist. Always. The word rasped from a throat sewn shut by emotion. Always. Always he had loved her, before he was him and she was her, before they were Aedan and Edalene, before their concepts were even considered. Outside of time, like stories, his love for her resided. Since before we were, before everything was, before the old gods withered and the new took their places, before the material and immaterial. How dare you ask me how long? Time means nothing to my love for you. And the floodgates broke. Aedan's body was racked with sobs, his chest rising and falling without a rhythm, dictated instead by the waves of love and fear that ran through him. He could not respond to Edalene any further, but instead cried with her. Returning her kiss, wet with the saltiness of his tears and trembling lips, Aedan pulled Edalene to him. Wrapping her in arms that were formerly weak, the strength with which he held her was impressive. Pulling her down next to him, he held her close, crying into her hair. The twins stayed that way as the world resumed, and Aedan felt every vibration in the world around him. Admitting his truth opened him, emptied him, scraped him clean. And now that she knew, they could go forward. Still crying, sleep began to overtake the brunette boy. In the twilight between the waking world and sleep, Aedan murmured into Edalene's hair, I will wake with you every trial. I will tuck you in every night. As it has no beginning, so too will my love never have an end. Sleep, dear sister, and be comforted in the warmth of my embrace. And with that, he drifted into a sleep deeper than any he could ever remember.
The night lay wasted behind them, cast aside like the skin of a snake. The Waystone had seen many sacrifices in its time. Since before the gods of foreign plains descended upon the world, since before the race of man first blinked doe-eyed from the wreckage of their creators, since before the chaos and tumult as new gods bickered and the world burned. Many sacrifices, many bones laid sleeping in the roots beneath its foundations and lost to dust around it. Few such sacrifices were as great as the one offered by Aedan. In the moments of solemnity above the stone, he cast his very life to the bones at his feet, knowing that the truth may shatter all he has ever known and ever loved. And in a distant place, far older than the stone or even the land around it, something heard the sound it made, something wandering, lost, alone, and burdened with terrible purpose. It watched them now, asleep, hanging from the branches of the trees far above them. Edalene's bear watched it warily, but the luminescent figure held no interest for the other spirit. 4 fire anaks, merely sparks, danced around where the professor slept as a slow earth anak, a rolling stone no larger than a fist, plotted weary circles around the tent. These, too, held no interest to the dearie. It had eyes only for the brunette boy, whose voice it had heard clearly in the misty miasma of Amaya. It was his voice that had led it, stumbling, grasping, from the beyond, and now its alien intentions remained unknown to him. It had a polished face, like ceramic, and 3 golden eyes. They were set in a cluster, each geometrically equal to the other, like rough prisms, motes of light similar to the ones at the end of its tentacled hair fluttered and danced like fireflies. One hand clung tightly to the branch suspended above the sleeping twins, long fingers wrapped around the wood to hold its weight. No larger than a child of 5 or 6, it observed them curiously, opened an eerily human mouth to speak, and could say nothing. Frustration crossed its alien features, and it settled back onto the branch, never taking its golden gaze from the one who had called it here from so far away. The morning found them slumbering long after the sun had climbed into the sky. Locusts rasped their chirping words, and the cacophony of bird song finally shook Aedan and Edalene from their slumber. They felt rested, as though they had not trekked miles the day before through rough and tangled terrain. Aedan's legs felt better than they had in a long time, and the cut they had offered the Waystone had sealed, leaving the faintest white scar in its wake. It wasn't the sizzling that drew their attention back to the fire pit, but the smell of frying pork fat. Thick slabs of marbled bacon popped and hissed merrily in the skillet. Thomas had freed from another part of his enormous backpack. It was improbable that he had hunted down a wild pig to procure it himself, leaving only the impression that somehow he had brought it with him on the journey. While the meat should have spoiled, the smell that found them was anything but. Already the bowls from the earlier night had reappeared, now filled halfway with a thick, creamy purple substance, the color of lilac petals, and 4 thick cuts of wheat bread spread with pale butter, a black-blue jam, and a thick brown cream of some kind, one left plain to enjoy without accompaniment. Both wooden glasses were full of a red-pink liquid that fizzed with bubble on the tongue and tasted strongly of fresh strawberries. "Good morning," Thomas greeted them, flipping the bacon with a knife piece by piece. "My sweet morning larks, I trust you slept well." He did not wait for an answer, spearing 2 pieces of the thick bacon each and laying them on flat wooden plates, seemingly carved from the same set as the spoons and cups, before handing them across the small fire to them. He included the spoons as well and indicated the purple substance. "A yogurt, dairy dish from Athart. Once upon a time it was customary to feed slaves with it, but as flavors were introduced, it migrated to becoming a part of the noble cuisine." With a wink, he indicated the bread and the cup. "You are familiar with butter, I trust, selected from a dairy farmer friend of mine. I teach his children their letters every 12th trial, and he pays me with his bounty. I have it on good authority the cow who provided this butter is named Mabel, and she is quite the adventurous personality." Laughter, booming, free. Appropriate for our morning repast, I think. The jam is a preserve I prepared myself, something of a hobby, really, with blackberries and blueberries, a touch of pepper oil for an unexpected kick. I'd very much be interested in your opinions, and the last is also a kind of butter, from ground peanuts. Traditionally, this is a Hildreth staple, but peanuts are not so hard to get hold of if you know the right merchant. He winked, knowingly, as if the twins had any idea what merchant he referred to. Finally, that drink is a strawberry cordial. There's a monk outside of Crome who prepares a few bottles from his personal patch. I am told there is no tartar strawberry in all Ruinfall. Makes for an excellent cordial, as I'm sure you'll find. He indicated the half-full glass bottles set on the grass near their plates. Feel free to indulge to your heart's content. We will pack after, strike the camp, and carry on to the belly of the beast. Thomas chuckled, but it was difficult to tell whether he was serious in his warning. After the meal, Thomas hefted the immense bag onto his back and started for the trees. Rather than passing the waystone, they took a more southern direction, cutting through the trees as if Thomas alone could see a hidden path. The pace was faster today, but neither of the twins felt the rigors of the journey. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that Aeodan began to feel his legs tense and strain under the weight of his gear and the difficulty of path. Up and down they went, leaning heavily against steep slopes and hopping diagonally down hills. They avoided tangles, vines, thorny bushes, and once Professor Terence leaned down to examine an impression left in the loam and mud. "Aeodan," he said simply, and they took another path entirely. In the wake of the storm, the forest had unfurled. Thick pine aromas mingled with the cloying loam, filling each breath in with the woods. Edalene and Aeodan could almost taste bark and needles on their tongue. Few times in their lives had they found each other out in the wilderness. While neither was necessarily a stranger to wild, they had never ventured so far into the forest outside Andaris before. Even at their highest point, they could see no sign of the city they left behind and only the unmodified wilderness before them. Thomas seemed to brighten the closer they got to their destination, occasionally breaking into song. Some in languages Aeodan knew, others in tongues he did not. Each song was new to the twins, some relic long lost from ages before even their grandparents were born. He spoke with them a little, occasionally interrupting the silence with anecdotes and stories he had encountered in his journeys. It was clear Professor Terence was a traveler, but it was difficult to swallow how much he had moved around Idyllis. While his later years had mostly been spent in Ruinfall, it seemed that the majority of his childhood and early adulthood were mired in different beds, new places, and constant danger. That experience collected at the corners of his eyes, his mouth, and the wrinkles on his hands. It was easy to overlook the signs of age. Save for the wear and tear at the edges of his life, Thomas was a cherubic guide. The fat in his face made him look younger, but no doubt the weight had begun to take its toll. At the height of the afternoon, Thomas stopped in the shadow of another slope. For the first time since the journey began, Edalene saw the mage pull the tiny copper vial which contained the map. Slipping the simple thing free, he consulted it without a word, his eyes roaming over the steep incline. Satisfied, he rolled it up and slipped it back into the vial, returning it to his pocket. He set his bag down against the roots of a pine tree and motioned that the twins should stand back. 12 arcs ago, Thomas began, slowly stepping along the base of the steep rise, there was a bandit by the name of Rufus Maslow, went by Blackbird to his gang. The slope stretched maybe 30 yards in length before tapering on either side, strangely not contiguous with the rest of the geography. He and his men raided supply caravans bound out of Andaris for 3 arcs without the Iron Hand getting any closer to stopping him. It seemed at the time that he must have some sort of base in the forest, a place where he and his own would lie low and wait to ambush. Each man was a capable survivalist. Most had been woodcutters from Burhan land who suffered under a brat of an heir. Politics. He paused 10 yards from where he began, walked back 6 feet, paused, and then returned to the same place. The slope looked the same as the rest, a muddy slope eroding without many trees or roots to hold it in place. After 3 arcs, the attack stopped. Just like that. No hanging, no successful capture, just nothing. Word got around that Blackbird had died, along with many of his men, in the lair of something terrible. One has to imagine that at least one of them escaped, or we wouldn't have the story. Professor Terence laughed. It was a dry, joyless sound. That man is named Heath Barclay, and he sold me the map I currently hold, a bit of scratch to help new recruits find the hideout deep in the Andaris forest. Thomas put out both hands as if he were preparing to push something. His eyes were closed. Heath was poor. His family was poor. I offered good coin, but even with it on the table, he cautioned me against finding this place. Cursed, he called it, home to demons and gods. Thomas opened his eyes and drew his hands harshly apart. The slope exploded in front of where Thomas stood, earth roiling and twisting like ungainly snakes to hurl itself out of the way. Birds took wing from the trees at the top of the rise as the ground vomited itself in a froth of mud across the forest floor. Beneath it all, hidden by years of dirt and no doubt a deliberate collapse, were two massive stone doors. The slope was no slope at all, but some ancient structure so primordial that the forest had simply grown up around it and upon it. One of the doors lay open, much too large for any but a group of men to move, and the other was closed. Strange, swirling shapes crawled across the stone, so faded with time that it was only possible to tell that they had once been quite beautiful. Old air greeted them, the smell of rotting flesh and age. It billowed out, strangely warm against the faces of the twins. Like a rushing ghost, it tore through their hair and then vanished, hissing, into the woods. Without the birds, what followed was unsettling silence. Thomas eyed the opening carefully and returned to his pack. Slowly and deliberately, he drew out a light crossbow, fitted a small quarrel hanging from its stock, and an axe. The head was wrapped in doeskin, and when Thomas removed it, the exquisite weapon greeted the day. An artisan had no doubt spent trials, perhaps even cycles, meticulously inscribing the axe with patterns, crescents, and designs. It was small, no larger than a hand axe, but the blade gleamed with a greenish off-color, and the designs chiseled into the metal almost seemed to beckon, call. Its handle was a polished wood only 2 shades from true black. Thomas clipped this to his belt and retrieved a small leather-bound excavation kit, his lantern, a clay jug of water, and a tiny box inlaid with metal fashioned like a dragon's head, complete with rubies inset for eyes and ivory carefully carved for its fangs. Thomas regarded this box for a few trails longer than any other item he removed, clearly torn on whether he should bring it. Finally, he glanced back to the twins and let out a sigh so long he must have been holding his breath. Plucking the box from where he'd placed it outside the pack, he slipped it into an inside pocket of his coat, secured the rest of the pack in rope, hurling it over a high branch and raising it to slightly higher than the roof of the Burnett household, tying a knot at the base of the tree to keep the pack swaying. They called this place the Temple, though I could not say, without examination, whether there is any religious significance. Inside, we should find the remains of a civilization that predates Rinmir's castles and politics, perhaps even predates us in our time on Idolus. We are also likely to find immense danger. Heath survived only because he was retrieving firewood with a friend at the time of the attack. While his friend ventured in to seek the source of the screaming, he never reemerged. He thought it best, being a superstitious man, to bury the entrance with the last resort Blackbird had seen to in case they were followed by the Iron Hand. The mirth was gone now, something older and experienced having replaced the soft, bouncing frivolity of his usual demeanor. What you must understand is that Blackbird's company boasted nearly 60 men. None save Heath made it out alive, and I need you to consider the gravity of that before you go further. You may, if you wish, remain here with the bags while I venture in. You will wait till evening, and if, in the morning, I have not returned, you will return to Andaris. Slipping the pocket watch out of his pocket, he turned it and clicked open the lid by compressing the top. It was not a watch at all, but a compass that certainly did not point north. Thomas dangled the gold bauble closer to Edalene, then Aeodan. This compass will lead you home. If you stay, I will entrust it to you, my Spitfire, my Snapdragon, and you will take helm of the expedition back. And you, he turned toward Aeodan, my lark, my student, my young star, will take the map. He tapped the shape of the copper vial in his pocket, should you ever seek to return with reinforcements. Swinging the pocket compass back to his palm, he closed the lid and glanced back over his shoulder at the yawning entrance. If you are to come with me, please retrieve only that which you need and hoist your bags into the trees like mine. Thomas fished around in his pack again and retrieved dried summer sausage, wheat crackers, and a rich sun-yellow quarter rind of cheddar cheese. In any case, we will eat before before I or we begin the exploration. Remember to touch only that which you must, and disturb nothing without accepting the consequences. Old things lurk in places like these, ancient things who have forgotten their purpose, demons who answer to no gods, or perhaps old gods themselves. A thief plunders for treasure. A soldier invades for glory or honor. A scholar explores for knowledge. Remember this truth, for you do not want to be mistaken for either of the former. Taking a seat against a birch trunk, Thomas cut himself a bit of sausage and cheese, building a tiny tower of crackers, and watched the entrance. Nothing emerged. Nothing entered. Not even the birds would return. But the twins could feel what Thomas no doubt could. The mage, the professor who had led them here, it was impossible he didn't. Eyes. Millions of eyes. Uncountable eyes in the darkness, focusing against the harsh light. Both Edalene and Aeodan could feel them, searching, seeking, even if they couldn't articulate why. Thomas bit into the sausage and didn't say a word.
Edalene woke slowly, as if emerging from the deepest of memories. She was warm, even as they had fallen asleep outside before the dying embers of the fire she had made, but it was in the arms of her brother that were wrapped around her that truly kept him warm. She awoke slowly before him and looked at her brother. Edalene marvelled. Had last night truly happened? Had Aeodan truly said what he had? It felt almost unreal, but the more she pondered over his words, his eyelashes fluttering softly against his cheeks in his sleep, the more it made sense. Of course he loved her. Why did it matter what that love meant? Deep inside, she knew she loved him too. It was easy and obvious. With every breath, she loved him. With every thought of every trial, she was pulled back to him. But there was a sadness there deep in the pit of her belly that she could not give name to or reason, but she knew it was in the shape of two dear ones, two dear people that were not the twins, that she could not betray. But still, love would remain. She smiled softly and leant down, brushing a tender kiss to Aeodan's forehead, waking him softly as a lover would. "Good morning," she murmured as he roused from sleep. A hand came up to stroke his collarbone. "Did you sleep well? Any pain?" A glance broke their reverie, and she noticed Thomas not too far away. "It seems that Thomas has somehow realized your love of pork fat. Breakfast seems to be ready." Almost reluctantly, she disentangled from his embrace and realized again how much Aeodan was a magnet for her. Leaving his arms felt almost like trying to pull apart two things that should never be separated. A soft, small, bittersweet smile graced her face. There was so much to say, but this was not the time or the place. Aeodan would know, looking into Edalene's eyes, just what she meant, attuned to his sister as he was. Later. Edalene took Aeodan's hand as she moved into the breakfast station that Thomas had set up. Just because they couldn't speak of it yet didn't mean she didn't want to be close to him at all times. It had always been natural for the twins to hold hands, to be touching, and why would it be any less natural now? Edalene smiled as she sat. Even his strange pet names couldn't ruin her mood this morning. "Like a log," she agreed, taking a seat gracefully and tugging Aeodan down with her so that his thigh was pressed against her own. Edalene giggled at the professor's antics. Everything was a story with him, and in the night that had passed, her ire and anger towards him had already disappeared. "Thank you for preparing breakfast, sir," she said, taking the proffered plate. "It looks delicious." She began to eat and shot glances towards her brother to make sure he was eating too. They had an arduous day ahead. Sated on the delicious meal, they packed up the camp easily, and Edalene did not even protest too much about Aeodan overexerting himself. There was a new trust there, even more than had already existed, and instead she just watched him fondly as he moved, lithe and easy, as if his legs had never given him pain. Always now there was a soft smile on her lips as she watched her brother. When they set off on the trail, she took his hand easily, helping him when he needed, but content to simply walk with her brother, the one she loved more than anything. She smiled at the ease at which he sung, knowing Aeodan would delight in the languages, and often would respond with stories of her own, histories of the places Thomas mentioned in his travels, but for the most part she was content to walk silently, admiring the beauty of the forest and the beauty of her brother beside her. And when it was at its hottest, Thomas drew the twins to a pause and pulled up her map, the map he had enticed her into this journey with. The scholar Edalene itched to reach out, snatch the map, and pore over its details and secrets with all the hunger of academia that lived inside of her. But she waited, listening only to yet another of Thomas's stories. But this was not a story of him, and there was a gravity in his words that indicated this, whatever it was, wherever it led them, was their true purpose in their mission. Chills went through Edalene's skin, and she felt her hands tighten on Aeodan's as the professor told them the tale. These men, all of them, disappearing. This was the stuff of folklore legends, but here was history in front of her. And the one escaped man, daring them not to come. Once Edalene would have been angry, railing against the professor for bringing her brother to such a horrible, cursed place. But now she watched with only an open mouth as with his magic, Thomas rent apart the cliff, tearing it in two, like opening a curtain to a summer's day. A low gasp escaped her lip, and she drew Aeodan tighter to her. Not to protect him, but to almost assure herself that this was real. She was seeing magic and stories in the flesh. These doors, they held history and fear in them. She could almost smell it. It wasn't just that the air was old, dust and dirt and moss and mold, but there was fear in the air, like human screams had frozen fear there, and death. There was death here too. Edalene swallowed, her mouth suddenly dry, and it was the strangest thing. It was almost like the doors were calling her to come forth, to touch them, to just let them swallow her up. She almost did it. She almost took a step forward and walked into her own grave. But Thomas spoke again, waking her from her reverie, and Aeodan's hand still held her to this, the human earth. Demons and gods Thomas had spoken of at the Waystone. That was what this was, she was sure of it. Demons and gods. Fear was in her, she knew, somewhere tucked away inside her bones, screaming to be let out and let her run. But there was a strange pull, and she knew what it was. It was that almost suicidal thirst for knowledge, to know what lay beyond, a thirst that could not be understood by any unless they were like them, Edalene and Aeodan and Thomas. She knew he had been speaking of old civilizations and screaming, but it was only when he held the compass out to her and she took it automatically that she looked at the professor's face properly. Where his eyes had been crinkled with mirth before, they were somber. Death. They were walking into a place of death. It was suicide. But with Aeodan's hand in hers, she felt the strength only her brother and history could give her. Her bear was apprehensive, but how could she, a Shervain, walk away from such a place of time? I'm coming in, it was said strongly. She squeezed Aeodan's hand as if to tell him he did not have to, but she knew he would. He would always go where Edalene went. I need to know why the air is so bitter, so cold. Her bear growled and she looked to him, but the decision was made, for her anyway. She went to her bag, finally releasing Aeodan's hand. Already she felt bereft. First, she took Tiartha's kaleidoscope. It would do her well in here if anything had been touched by immortals. She retrieved water, a tinderbox, some food, and realized she had no weapons. She could only bring in herself, her brother, and her bear. Knowledge would have to protect her now. But sometimes ignorance was bliss. Ignorance of the eyes watching her would make it so much easier to walk into the temple. Edalene knew she would walk to those eyes anyway.
His flesh was cold, colder than it had been in Ark's. Not since he found himself buried in snow could he feel the dull ache of numbness crawling into his bones. Aeodan breathed out, and his breath formed in front of his face. There was something out there, in the dark cold, watching him with eyes he couldn't see. Goosebumps raised along his arms, unrelated to the freezing temperature closing in around him. Aedan took a step but gained no distance. He tried to say something to call for help, but he found that nothing would come out. Instead, try as he might, it was as if his voice had been stolen from him. Panic rose in his chest, causing his heart to beat steadily against his sternum. He tore at his shirt, trying to free the painful organ from its bone prison, but nothing worked. He tried to scream, to rally against the futility. The kiss to his forehead roused him from the nightmare. A slick sheen had formed on his face, sticking to Edalene's lips like a salty balm as she pulled away. Aedan's eyes opened slowly, hazily, as he pulled himself from the dream. He could not shake the feeling of being watched by some sort of powerful being, like being observed by some disinterested god as he struggled with the weight of his truth on he and his sister. And yet, here she was, coming with him to greet the morning with love and tenderness. A soft smile replaced the hard frown that had formed in his sleep, and he rubbed crust from his eyes with his left hand. Good morning, darling. He ran a soft hand over her forearm, trailing a trimmed fingernail along it. No pain whatsoever. Did you sleep well? Were you warm enough? His eyes studied her face, subtly searching for hints that she had harbored strange feelings about his revelation. Instead, Edalene appeared more at peace than Aedan had ever seen her. He couldn't help the smile that bloomed over his face, a beautiful flower on a sunny morning. Indeed he did. I can't say I'm upset. I could eat a rasher of bacon and eat every hunk of that delicious bread he had last evening. Speaking truth can lead one to the very brink of ravenous. He smiled, though his stomach somersaulted at his mentioning his truth. Still unsure of Edalene's true reaction to his words, Aedan thought it best to leave it alone. Unfortunately, the boy twin hadn't thought of his words before he spoke them. He tried to pass it off by rolling out of bed, rising immediately to his feet on steady legs. Very well, Professor, thank you. His eyes surveyed the smorgasbord laid before them, a grin plastered on his face. His eyes were all delight as he examined each dish as it was explained, lifting each to sniff or taste slightly as Thomas described it. The yogurt was tart and tangy, with a strange creamy consistency that Aedan found very pleasant. The butter was nice and salty, smooth on the bread. Taking a sip of the strawberry cordial to cleanse his palate, Aedan found a strangely exuberant clash of carbonated liquid and fresh fruit. With a delighted he took another sip of the drink before replacing the cup in his hand with a piece of bread with jam on it. A large bite came from it, and Aedan moaned in delight as he looked towards the professor, complimenting the professor with a sound and gaze. He dropped his free hand to Ida's thigh, nudging her slightly to try the jam. The taste of berries in addition to the heat of the pepper oil was a magnificent combination that Aedan finished the bread before moving on to the bacon. After devouring everything that remained and washing it all down with yet another glass of the cordial, Aedan rose to his feet. He helped Edalene to hers, sparks dancing on his nerves and touching her skin. They all packed the camp jovially, telling jokes and laughing between the three of them. When they were all packed, Aedan wiped a thin layer of exertion sweat from his face and locked fingers with his sister. As they set off, Aedan's smile radiated brighter than the suns of Idalos ever could. The trails couldn't dampen his mood, and he whistled along as they walked. The songs that poured forth from the professor were foreign and alien to the twins, but it did not stop Aedan from enjoying them. He bobbed his head along, gait changing to reflect the rhythm of the songs. He pushed Ida out a little and pulled her back in, twirling her along a spiral and catching her, never changing the tempo of their walk. With a wide smile, Aedan spun her back out and pulled her back to his side, gripping her hand tightly. And so the trio advanced their mission, putting behind them their shames and advancing into their destinies. As the suns reached their zeniths, the party paused for Thomas to consult the map in his vial. Cocking his head to the side, Aedan's interest was piqued by the extremely small vial and map, having not been enticed along by it. Instead, he came at the behest of his sister, and he'd never been happier to do so. Aedan smiled again at the thought of him holding his sister as they slept, and his mood soared as the professor began his exposition. Chills ran over Aedan's skin as the professor told the story, prompting him to move closer to Edalene despite the heat of the trial. Aedan had heard the story of Blackbird before, but had never heard anything quite so in-depth. Something in him felt strange, as if there were a rat trying to scurry through his intestines. He gripped Ida's hand with surprising strength as the professor continued his story. The word cursed bounced around the brunette boy's mind, echoing in the long hallways of his imagination. This, coupled with the fear sitting deep in his gut, caused him to physically startle at the professor's defiance. Trying to mask his embarrassment, Aedan transitioned the recoil into a move pulling Edalene away, acting as if he were shielding her from the stone. He knew that Thomas was in control, but it still did nothing to prevent Aedan's protective instinct. He held his sister close to him as Thomas revealed the entrance to a tomb not accessed for far too long. A sigh of antiquated air washed over the trio, filling Aedan's nostrils with stagnation and dust. He sneezed, against his will, as he peered deeply into the caved-in tomb. A strange sense filled Aedan then, the same coldness that had crept into his limbs in his nightmare the night before. If he were being watched by forces beyond his control, as if being watched by forces beyond his control, Aedan's hair stood on end. Turning to the professor, the young boy watched as he prepared his gear and hung the rest of his belongings. I'm sure there are wonders untold in that darkness. I'm going. His voice was resolute, and the younger Burnett twin smiled. He took from his pack his water skin and food rations, securing the rest. He, like his sister, had brought no weapons. He entertained no delusions of his skill with martial weapons, and he relied on his mind to be his greatest weapon. Happily, he strung up the pack and joined Thomas and his sister for lunch. Smiling, he took a bit of the sausage and stared into the darkness. He felt it, but wouldn't admit it. The darkness was staring back into him.
Dun, dun, dun. So we decided that this would be a good place to pause. This will be part 1 of Ruinfall. And I guess before we stop recording, how do you guys feel about doing your first Standing Trials live read?
Wow.
I noticed that Edalene smiles a lot.
Same for Aedan.
Like, you know, when you haven't really thought that much about a thread as a whole, because when you're writing, you're just focusing on the one post. And now I'm like, she smiles way too much. She's too happy. No, it's interesting reading it back. And I was thinking as we were going through that I started Edalene in March, and this thread was written in July, and I feel like this is the first time she really, really came alive to me.
Yeah, I think the more I read it, like it's to see how far they've come since here. Like it's weird to go back and read it again out loud and like have everything kind of hit again. I make a lot of typos. I'm just saying.
I think that's just part and parcel of everyone writing on the forum RPs, though.
I mean, but I should like proofread or be better at my life.
And also, I don't know. I think I didn't really see a lot of typos. Like from my perspective, you guys are very close to this. So from my perspective, you guys are both beautiful writers, and Plague is too, obviously. So it was really, really cool to read through this thread and to see how well you all write together, because it flows very well. And it's like you guys have just really built this really, I would say, great beginning to a story at this point. So hopefully everyone who's listening is excited to listen to part 2 when we get a chance to put that together.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Yeah, the greatest thing about this is the incest revelation is the least weird thing that happened.
Yeah, you thought that was the bomb dropping? No. There's more.
It only gets better from here.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I'll give a quick shout out to Plague as a thank you for letting me read his part. And thank you both, Harpy and Djinn, for calling on and spending 2+ hours reading this thread with me.
That's what we're here for.
Yeah.
There's nothing else I would rather do at 4 a.m.
Yeah, that's right. Can we just get a big shout out to Harpy for waking up at 4 a.m. to read this thread? Oh my God. Time zone problems.
Right.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Thank you both. And we'll get this posted soon.
Thanks, Rue.
Thanks.
Thank you.